Welcome to the 23rd Annual Council Retreat. We've got a pretty heavy schedule for the next couple of days, and I wanted to get started by, first of all, thanking our staff for putting this together. There's a lot of material in here for us to go over the next 24, 48 hours. And I also want to thank the members of our department heads and their staffs for all the work they did in putting their documents together as well. This will be my 8th retreat, and Bill's, Councilman Broadway's over there is going to be his 12th, I believe. Isn't that correct? So we've been down this road a few times. What I would say is that we need to make this a very productive meeting. And so what I've done is I've put together a couple of notes I would like to just state before we get started here. I see that we have really 4 things to accomplish here. And there's no slide for this. I'm just going to tell you off my notes. First thing we need to do is listen. We need to listen to the information that's been presented to us by the staff and the outside parties that are visiting with us, and understand the impacts of what they're saying. Also, we need to listen to our own selves, the comments that we make as we move forward in this process, and make sure that they're well thought out and sound comments that we make. And then we need to assess what we've heard. We need to assess it in terms of its relevance, importance to the financial impact to the city's budget, the financial impact to the taxpayers, and the overall improvement to the city of Goldsboro, and making it a great place to live, work, and play. And the third thing is we need to be prepared and should make decisions and provide guidance as a result of the information that we hear today and tomorrow. There are several issues that are going to come up that we need to give direction and decisions on. The general and utility fund balance. We need to look at the information that's presented and determine if we're going to keep these fund balances where they are, or we're going to move them forward and so forth. And our utility rates, that goes along with what I just mentioned about fund balance, except we've got utility rates as well. And then we've got our Homeless Commission Advisory Board that we need to talk about and make a decision as to how we move forward on it. Our downtown parking, that information is going to be given to us by the consultant that you heard at the parking public hearing, and hopefully we can make a decision about that. And then tomorrow we'll hear our Downtown Development Director talk about Goldsboro hosting the 2024 Main Street Conference. We had one back in 2016 that we hosted. It was quite successful. We've been asked to host it next year, and she'll give us details about that. We need to make a decision about that as well. And we have to tell the Main Street Agency up in Raleigh on Friday whether or not we're going to do that. We also need to talk about the election procedures that we've had some discussion on before. We need to tomorrow determine whether or not, but what our next process is going to be, and we'll talk more about that at that time. And then we'll talk about our council budget. We'll go through the council budget and talk about that and look at the coming year. And then our non-profit organizations, we need to talk about and try to reach some decision about how we move forward on that. And then finally, the 23-24 budget, and that will be covered by our manager, and talk about the general and department specific needs and how it impacts on personnel, pay, equipment, et cetera, et cetera. And then the fourth and final thing is we establish goals as we move forward in the coming year. And so we've got a big responsibility in front of us. I hope we can be very productive and leave here tomorrow afternoon feeling comfortable about what we've done, and as we go back and look over what we have done today and tomorrow, we should leave here saying this was a well worth meeting. So at this point, I'm going to ask that we officially call this thing to order, and our clerk will call the roll.
Mayor Ham.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Polak.
Present.
Councilman Broadway. Councilwoman Matthews. Present. Councilman Gaylor.
Present.
Councilman Bass.
Here.
Councilwoman Jones is not here. She's not feeling well today. She did call in and let us know she would not be here. I've said what I want to say, so I'm going to turn it over to our manager, Mr. Salmon.
Thank you, Mayor. Good morning, everyone, council members, staff, public, consultants. Thank you for being here today. I hope this is beneficial to everybody involved. I've worked pretty closely with council members and staff to put together 2 days of presentations for you on information that is of important topics as well as budget-related issues for us going forward. So I think this will have hopefully a good impact on what our local government will do in the future. We start out with about an hour of financial updates, which is important. It's the baseline of what we can do now and going forward. So I look forward to our 2021 audit from Forvis here, and then an update from Davenport on those 2021 audit numbers, and then Catherine will give us an update on execution for fiscal year 22-23. So without any further ado, if we could get our Forvis presenters up. They've handed out to each of you their presentation or their audit. I would also mention to council members that our assistant city manager gave you evaluation forms for each presentation. If you could fill that out, and then there will be one for the overall retreat that you can complete as well to help us make sure we capture all the feedback and we can make this better going forward. Did I see something from you, Councilwoman Matthews?
I just didn't know if we were supposed to adopt the.
Yeah, I was waiting for you to finish.
Okay. To adopt the agenda? Is that what you're saying?
When you finish, I'll ask for it.
Yes, sir.
I mean, not the minutes, but the agenda.
I'm complete.
Okay, you have a copy of the agenda in front of you. Is there a motion? Is there any changes or additions to the agenda?
I would like to make some requests. I want to ask the council to consider removing the election method discussion from this agenda, and with the intent to hold a public forum to include the public's input before we decide and make a decision on what the next election looks like. Also for Thursday, forgive me, but I will not be here. So I'm also asking that we remove the council budget discussion as well as the MPO budget discussion to either the next council meeting in March, or we hold some type of forum to discuss that. But those are two topics that I would really like to participate in. And unfortunately, because of my other obligations, I cannot make tomorrow. So those are.
Let me comment, if I may, please. On the election method decision or discussion, in my mind, there was no intent to make a decision on that at this meeting. It was just to make a decision on date to discuss that at the next meeting and to set a date for a public hearing.
Okay, if that's the intent, maybe I misunderstood what you said in your notes earlier, because it sounded as if a decision would be made by the end of tomorrow concerning this and how we move forward. So if that is the true intent, then I will remove that from my request. But in light of the other two items for tomorrow, that is the 11 o'clock presentation for the budget, as well as the 11:30 presentation for the MPO budget discussion.
Is there any reorganization of the agenda? I know this is a big question. I apologize. Is there any reorganization that can be done to pull the two items from tomorrow? Because they're pretty
Both
items.
Both of these items could go at the end of the day, and then
If it fits your needs, Councilwoman, because I absolutely agree that you need to be present for them. If we can move them to the end of today, and then still be able to get them in, I would prefer to do that.
you could potentially save we got 45 minutes in line for your wrap-up at the end of the day and just make it a second day total wrap-up. Or you can wrap up after you do those two presentations, depending on how much time you want to spend here. Well, I'm looking for guidance on how we put the budget together on these issues. So, I mean, I think it's a worthy discussion item to have sooner than later. I do need some guidance on the current nonprofits. There are two current nonprofits that are funded that I have not signed off on yet. You gave me with the policy authorization to waive audit requirements, and I wanted to have that discussion so that we can.
What if we just move them at the end of today's session? Anybody object to that? So we'll move 11 o'clock and 11:30 items for tomorrow to start at the end of the session today at 4:30.
We would probably start it at 3:45, sir. Would that be okay?
Yep,
Move your wrap up later?
yep.
Okay.
3:45, is that satisfactory?
It does satisfy me not being here, but we are missing somebody. I'll reach out to her to see how she feels about moving it. I think it's a discussion that all of us need to participate in and be intentional about participating in it. And I know it has been outlined for this. I'm just saying, I think the necessary time and attention that this deserves, should still take place. I don't want it to be rushed. I don't want us to just throw it somewhere at the end of the day. I appreciate that suggestion, but
Well, what does council want to do? Is there a motion to adopt the agenda with deleting the two items for tomorrow at 11 o'clock and 11:30?
I'm sorry, Mayor, can you say that another time?
I asked if there was a motion to adopt the agenda with deleting those two items.
So moved.
Okay, so we have a motion on the floor to remove them right now with a second.
Second.
And now you need a discussion.
Is there any further discussion? All in favor of adopting the agenda, removing the two items for tomorrow at 11 and 11:30, signify by raising your hand. We have 3. All opposed? Got 3.
Okay?
Mayor, just to see if we get a different number, I move that we amend the agenda to relocate the two items to this afternoon so that we can continue the discussion.
The first motion fails, so we have a motion now to adopt a budget with moving the two items for tomorrow at 11 and 11:30 to the end of the session this afternoon, beginning at 3:45. Is there a second? Motion made and second. Any discussion? All in favor of the motion signify by raising your hand. Got the same. We got 4. Motion carries. So we'll move these two items to this afternoon.
I oppose. I
Okay.
want to make it seem like I don't.
Okay, and those opposed? Okay. Sorry. And 2 opposed. Okay,
I would say just because we discussed the items doesn't mean you have to draw final conclusions on those items. You may or may not, but at least we get them out on the table, so I appreciate that. Okay. So we're ready for Forbes. If you're ready, Mayor.
go ahead, sir.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. Appreciate you allowing us to join this morning at this beautiful facility to discuss the audit. As the city manager mentioned, each of you should have received this report to the city council this morning. And we're just going to run through a few highlights of this report and certainly give you an opportunity to answer any questions that you might have. I'm going to turn it over to Chad Cook, who's going to go through the details of this report.
Thank you, John. And first, I just want to say thank you to Catherine and her team, the finance team. I know that certainly the audit process each year it's a lengthy process. We have a long request list, and they put a lot of time and hours into it. And we certainly appreciate all the efforts they were very quick and responsive to all of our requests this year. And so we're certainly thankful for all the work that they put in helping us get through the fiscal 2021 audit. So our audit, we have reviewed the annual comprehensive financial report with management for the fiscal year ended June 30th, 2021. It's our intention to finalize that report and submit it to the local government commission today following this presentation. Banner headline is that we did issue a clean or unmodified audit opinion on the fiscal 2021 financial statements. In addition, this year we were again required to complete a single audit. So because of the city's state and federal funding levels and the expenditures that were made with those grant funds, we also had to do a compliance audit. We'll go through that here in a little bit in the report. So looking at that report to the city council that was passed out, you'll see at the front on page 1, there's just some contact information. You'll see contact info for John and for myself. So if any questions should come up regarding the annual comprehensive financial report, once you all have a chance to review that, certainly you can feel free to reach out to John or I about any questions you may have about that report or just the audit process in general this year. Moving on to the next page, so we've got the communication with those charged with governance. So these are required communications at the conclusion of our audit. We've got certain things that we have to go through and explain to you all related to our responsibilities as well as management's responsibilities for the report. You may recall that previously we did present some financial information based on a preliminary draft a couple months back. We were not planning to go through financial information today in detail. The numbers that were previously presented did not change significantly in the final report. But again, certainly if you have any questions about any of the information within the report, feel free to reach out to us. So we'll start at the top of the report. Again, it's our responsibility to issue an opinion on whether the financial statements for the city are presented in all respects materially correct as it relates to the governmental activities, the business type activities, each major fund, and the aggregate remaining fund information for the city for the year ended June 30, 2021. In addition, we also have to complete our audit in accordance with government auditing standards, again, because of the federal and state funding that the city receives. As part of those requirements, we're also required to assess internal controls over financial reporting, and then also to assess compliance with laws and regulations, grant agreements, et cetera, which could have a material impact on the financial statements should there be non-compliance. If we were to come across any issues, we would be required to report those. And so this year, we're happy to report that we had no findings related to internal controls over financial reporting and no instances of non-compliance that would be material to the financial statements that we are required to report. Flipping to page 3, at the top, our responsibility under uniform guidance as well as the State Single Audit Implementation Act. So this talks about our responsibilities related to our compliance audit. This year, for fiscal 2021, we had to audit as major programs 2 federal programs. One was the Coronavirus Relief Fund, and the second was the capitalization grants for Clean Water State Revolving Fund. On the state side, we also had to audit the Powell bill. So we had 3 grant programs we had to look at and do detailed compliance testing of internal controls surrounding compliance with those programs. And as a result of those tests, we came across no instances of non-compliance that we were required to report, and no material weaknesses or significant deficiencies in internal controls surrounding those programs. The only finding that you'll see in the fiscal 2021 financial statements simply relates to the late submission of the financial statements themselves. So obviously each year at the conclusion of the audit, the financial statements are supposed to be submitted. Because you've got the federal and state funding, they do have to go to the federal audit clearinghouse since we're doing what we call a single audit. Because that timeline, the financials are not submitted by the official due date, we have to show that as a finding in the statements. But no other items. You may recall in the past we've had some other things that have been in the reports related to numbers and adjustments that were corrected in fiscal 19 and fiscal 20. No similar items this year. So really the only thing to report is that the financial statements obviously are late. Moving down, qualitative aspects of accounting practices. This section is where we'd like to point out if there are any changes in accounting policies or standards that could be impacting the statements this year when you compare fiscal 21 to fiscal 20 or other prior years. There were no new accounting policies adopted this year, and the application of existing policies was not changed. For fiscal 2022, that's going to change. There will be a new standard that you'll see in the fiscal 22 statements. It's GASB 87, which relates to leases. All the leases that the city has are going to be coming onto the balance sheet. I know Catherine and team are on top of that. They've already engaged a third-party software provider that also helps you assess the leases to kind of go through and help with getting all that information onto the books and making sure you've got a complete population there. But there will be a change in the financial statements in fiscal 22, so just something to be on the lookout for in the next report. Moving down, accounting estimates are an integral part of the financial statements. So obviously within the financials, there are certain things that are estimates and that assumptions go into those estimates. Should those assumptions not be correct, the financial statement figures could change by potentially a material amount. As part of our audit, we certainly go through and assess the estimates that are made, the reasonableness of the assumptions that go into those estimates, and we recalculate certainly the information. We don't have any concerns related to the estimates, but we are required to point out that there are significant estimates there. The significant estimates that we would like to point out would be number one, management's estimate of the allowance for doubtful accounts, which is based on historical collection experience and collateral, of capital assets, which is based on the expected useful lives of the individual capital assets themselves. Management's estimates of liabilities related to the pension plans and the other post-employment benefits. So that would be the Elders retirement plan, the law enforcement officer special separation allowance, and then the OPEB healthcare plan for retirees. Certainly those are large liabilities within the financial statements. Actuaries calculate most of that. A lot of the information, at least on the Elders plan, is handed down from the state. And so certainly, the individuals that went through that information and came up with the numbers are qualified, and the assumptions that they used, we assessed and are in agreement that they are reasonable assumptions. But certainly there are large estimates there, including the discount rates. Small changes in a discount rate can change the liability in the financial statements by a big number. So just something to be aware of. And then lastly, management's estimates of the liability for claims incurred but not reported, which are based on information provided by third parties, based on information that is provided to them by management. That's it for significant estimates. Moving on, the rest of the report, again, it's a lot of sort of boilerplate language, things that we're required to report. Some of the things that we'll kind of go through quickly: difficulties encountered in performing the audit, disagreements with management consultations with other accountants. These are things that, should we have anything to report there, we would be required to report. We had no such items, no disagreements, no difficulties, no in getting information or anything being withheld as we were going through our process. Management didn't engage anyone else to provide an opinion on financial statements where we didn't agree on anything. So nothing to report there. Everything went very smoothly. Corrected and uncorrected misstatements. We are required to report if there are any misstatements identified during the audit process that we consider to be material. None of the adjustments that we came across in the fiscal 2021 audit were considered material to the financial statements. In addition, we're required to report any uncorrected misstatements. So this could be misstatements that are within the financial statements, things that we came across that were not adjusted in the final report, but that we believe to be immaterial. We are still required to report those to you all. You will see that that's the reference Appendix B, which is at the very back of this report. If you have any questions about the uncorrected misstatements there, we're certainly happy to answer them. But Catherine and the team are certainly aware of what they are. Elected not to make those adjustments, just for consistency, number one, with prior years, and then also just due to timing of when some of these things were identified, and the fact that there could be implications into fiscal 22 and 23 that it would just be simpler to leave as is, given that we don't believe they're material. Other significant matters, findings, or issues. There is some information there that explains that the financial statements do contain some supplementary and other information that we perform more limited procedures over. Things like there's information related to the pension and OPEB plans. There's also management's discussion and analysis, and then there's other information in the financial statements, including statistical information and demographic information that the city puts together as part of their annual comprehensive financial report. We do not provide opinions directly on all of those items. We certainly read them, make sure that they are in alignment with our understanding based on the audit that we performed and the figures that are presented. But we are required to point out that certainly our opinion on those is sort of in relation to the financials, and we are not drilling down into the statistical information essentially as part of our audit when we're looking at the report. So just know that we don't take that section of the report to the same level of detail as we do the financial information. And with that, that's really the conclusion of our report. We don't have anything else prepared, but certainly we wanted to allow you all some time to ask any questions about the audit process or anything that might be within the fiscal 2021 financial statements. And so if anyone has any questions, we'd be happy to address those at this point.
Anyone have any questions? First of all, let me say it's a pleasure, real pleasure to see this in my hand here, even though it's a final draft. It's something that we've been waiting for a good while, and appreciate you being here. I know you both got up, drove quite a few ways to get down here this morning for a 15-minute presentation, but this is important to us. It's important to the cities and the taxpayers of Goldsboro. So we hope to get this in a final form here very recently so we can give it to the press and issue out copies to people that may want to have it. So thank you again. And if we have no other comments or questions, Jim, do you have anything you want to mention?
No, thank you very much. Appreciate the hard work, John and Chad, and everybody that's helped you, along with the finance department and the city staff that made it possible. We look forward to moving on with the next audit very shortly here, and then hopefully getting back on track with the FY 22-23 audit complete by next December. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Have a safe trip back to your next appointment. I know you're headed back west. Yes, sir.
Okay, so we have Davenport here? Yes, sir. Good to see you.
Good to see
Pull
you
up
as
your
well.
presentation. So Mitch from Davenport is going to give us a presentation on the numbers that would have come out of the draft FY 2021 audit that you just heard about. So it'll talk about different things from fund balances to expenditures, and I think this will be informative for you going forward.
Thank you, Tim, Mr. Mayor, and council members. Thank you for having us back again this year to the retreat. We're, as Mr. Salmon said, here to report on the numbers associated with the financial audited financial statement that was just distributed. We do have these, you'll note, we do have these characterized as a draft because those have not been sent through the Local Government Commission, as your auditors mentioned. But again, Mitch Bergoglio with Davenport and Company. We have been the city's financial advisor for a number of years, and in that role assist with various financial, capital planning, and various debt issuance. And so when we're looking at these financial statements and these numbers, we're looking at these from a perspective of credit strength. How would a lender or a bank evaluate the city's credit? How would the LGC or other interested parties evaluate the city's credit, much like we as individuals carry credit ourselves? So that's the light in which we'll be discussing these draft financials today. So starting out, I know we've talked about this over the years, but do want to provide a quick overview of where you are with your credit rating. We're going to go through some of these numbers, particularly the general fund, operations and fund balance, talk a little bit about the debt you have outstanding on both the general fund and the utility fund, and very brief discussion of some of the utility fund financials. So as I mentioned, we're, as the city's financial advisor, we often look at this from a lens of credit. And one of the most common ways of doing that in the municipal financial markets is a credit rating from the national credit rating agencies. There are three prominent national credit rating agencies. There are others out there, but the most common are Moody's, Investor Service, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch Ratings. Over the years, the city has had a credit rating from Moody's Investor Service and Standard & Poor's. Recently, I believe has been discussed, Moody's has put a hold on their current credit rating. They call it withdrawn until they're able to get more current financial information. So this 21 draft audit will be very helpful, and I know the 22 audit is coming behind that. S&P still maintains their credit rating for the city. That is a AA credit rating. The highest possible rating is a AAA. So at a AA rating, the city is 2 steps away from that highest possible credit rating. To put that into perspective, on a national basis, on the top right, there are over 2,100 cities and towns rated by Moody's nationally that are rated AAA, in the AAA category, the AA category, or the single A category. Again, that AAA category being the highest possible rating, and you all would fall right about into that AA rating category. I think what's interesting to see is, the highest rating category, about 10% of the country is rated in that highest possible rating category, but about 2/3 are rated in that AA rating category, which is the category that y'all are falling into. So I think in good company there, being in that AA rating category. And then you can see those same breakdowns in North Carolina. North Carolina tends to be a higher rated state than others. And so you can see about 1/3 of the cities and towns that are rated by Moody's in North Carolina are in that highest rating category. And then again, about 2/3 are in that AA category, which is where you all have historically fallen into. You'll note that there's only 39 cities and towns rated in North Carolina. Obviously, we have a lot more cities and towns in the state. That's because not everybody has needed to obtain a credit rating. The only reason you need to obtain a credit rating is if you issue municipal bonds in the public markets, like the general obligation bonds you all have issued in the past. That is the reason why you all and others have a rating, whereas many cities and towns do not. So this gives you a little bit of perspective on how you stack up nationally and within the state right now. And when we think about credit and financial strength within the municipal markets, credit rating agencies provide methodologies that give us very good insight into the type of things that they are looking at when evaluating a credit like the city's, the financial strength of someone like the city. In doing so, this is a good proxy for how other lenders like banks and the local government commission look at the city's credit as well. This is a very transparent place to go and see that. And so just at a very high level, I think it's important to refresh ourselves on what are folks looking at when evaluating the city's credit, and what do you all as a council have direct control over. So I think the easiest place to talk about it is in the top left corner of page 5, Moody's rating methodology. They have about 1/3 of their rating, or 1/3 of their evaluation of your credit strength, is based upon economy. This is things like the city's assessed value, the median family income in the city, the GDP of the surrounding area. Big picture economic things that you all do not necessarily have direct control over as part of this upcoming fiscal year 24 budget. There are certainly things that you all can do policy-wise to encourage economic development, encourage growth, encourage the type of growth that you all would like to see, but not necessarily something that you have short-term control over. So that's about 1/3 of the overall rate. Financial performance is the next category. That's another roughly 1/3 of the overall rating. And this is mainly looking at things like general fund balance and operating revenues versus operating expenses. Are you operating in a surplus scenario where your revenues exceed your expenses? Are you generating fund balance? Do you have a healthy fund balance? Are you adding to it at a reasonable level? And if you're using your fund balance, what is that being used on? So that's about 1/3 of the rating, and we'll get into a little more detail on that piece of it. Institutional framework is 10% of the rating. You're a city in North Carolina. Not a whole lot that you all can do about that. You operate under the North Carolina general statutes. Those are what they are. I guess long-term, you may have the ability to work with the legislature to try and make some changes to improve that. But grand scheme of things, not a whole lot you're going to do on that 10%. And then what they call leverage is the final 30%. This leverage is really debt outstanding or obligations, long-term obligations outstanding of the city. So think about your debt that you've issued over the years to fund capital projects, long-term liabilities like pension and longer-term health care benefits for retirees, those type of things fall into this leverage category. And again, that's an area where you all can control how much debt you have outstanding to a certain extent. You've done things over the years to manage that. You know, certainly have limited the amount of debt you've issued over the last several years, which as we'll see has been bringing that debt load down, which improves this piece of the overall credit look for you and the financial outlook for you as the city. So those are the key areas, and of those areas that you have control over, which is your financial performance, general fund operations, fund balance, and debt, that represents about 60% of that overall credit. So, you know, about 40% you do not have direct control over, so that's why we tend to focus on the 60% that you do have control over when evaluating that rating process. And I should have said, Mr. Mayor, others, if there's questions along the way, I'm happy to keep this conversational if that's easier for you all, however you'd like. Okay, so looking at the numbers here, I believe this format will be familiar to many of you all. Page 7 shows the historical performance of the general fund going back through 2017. And one of the things that we've talked about over the last several years is there has been a slight operational or what we call a structural imbalance where expenses have exceeded revenues coming in those fiscal years. That resulted in a drawdown in fund balance and general fund balance from its previous higher levels in 2017 down to the lowest level it hit in 2020. And over the years, we've talked about a number of the items that have contributed to that. You know, certainly some of the emergencies and national disasters have played an impact on that, waiting on reimbursement from FEMA and things like that. The good news is, with the 2021 draft financial statements, it appears that you all have gone back into what we call structural balance. Your annual revenues, that gold line in the top left chart, exceeded your expenses, your operating expenses, and which is the dark green bar, and your debt service, which is the light green bar. So your annual revenues were higher than your annual expenses. This allowed you to increase that general fund balance in fiscal year 21. The overall increase in that fund balance was about $1.6 million overall that the fund balance went up. Notably, though, there was a larger increase. If you look in the chart on the bottom right corner, line 7, there was a larger increase in your unassigned fund balance. Your unassigned fund balance is essentially your savings account, your rainy day fund, dollars that you have access to if you need to access them. And we'll talk about this in a moment, but that is a financial policy that the city has tied to that unassigned fund balance. And you can see in fiscal 21 that unassigned fund balance increased by $3 million. So part of what contributed to that, I believe, was the FEMA dollars, some of the FEMA money coming in, removing some of the restrictions on your fund balance. So overall, positive result, adding $1.6 million to fund balance, estimated in fiscal 21, and in particular, an even better result in the growth in unassigned fund balance. As I mentioned on page 8, the city has a policy to maintain a target of 15% unassigned fund balance as a percentage of the operating budget, and a minimum of 10% of the operating budget. And we have graphed those for you. The two graphs show general fund balance as a percent of expenditures on the left and revenues on the right. Essentially both measures of your general fund operating budget. And what you see, if we focus on the chart on the left, general fund balance as a percentage of expenditures, you fell below, as we've talked about, that 10% policy back in 2019 and stayed below it in 2020. But based upon the draft audit, whether we look at expenditures or revenues, it appears that the city will be back above that minimum policy level of 10%. And obviously a very good result in 21, and I think importantly brings you back in line with your financial policy, and is within, if you look at this second bullet, the period of time in which your financial policy says if you fall below your minimum level, you will establish a plan to get back into compliance within a 36-month period of time. And so, having fallen below in 2019, getting back in compliance by 2021, you fell within that 36-month period. So you did what your financial policy outlined for you all to do. One of the things that we'll look at here is a peer comparative to other rated cities and towns, both nationally and in North Carolina. That same group we looked at earlier. And I think this puts a little more perspective around that fund balance, and this is on page 9. The two charts on the left-hand side are looking at total general fund balance, so the overall balance within the general fund, whereas the two charts on the right are looking at that unassigned fund balance, that sort of bottom bucket, your savings account, your rainy day fund that you have access to. I'd suggest we focus on these graphs on the right-hand side of the page. The top graph is showing you the dollars of your unassigned fund balance. And you can see there, you all at Goldsboro have the 2021 draft dollar amount in the gold bar. And that for you all, again, is roughly $4.5 million. And you can see these light green bars are the national medians for AAA, AA, and single A cities and towns, that group we looked at earlier. And then the dark green bars are the North Carolina AAA, AA, and single A towns. On the North Carolina specific bars, you'll see we've layered in these blue lines on top of it. And what that shows you is the range of data points within those North Carolina cities and towns. So we are graphing the green lines, the green bars, that are graphed, those are the medians. So half of the data is higher, half of the data is lower. A lot of folks fall in, over 1,000, remember, fall into those national green bars. North Carolina is a little smaller subset, so we're able to pull out the data set for North Carolina, and you can see the lows and the highs within those various categories. I think you'll see, you all at roughly the $4.5 million, are kind of right on top of that, or are that minimum amount in that AA category for Moody's. We then go on to translate that into the unassigned fund balance as a percentage of your revenue in the bottom right chart. Remember, you all went back above your 10% minimum level in fiscal year 21, and you can see how that stacks up. Again, a little bit lower than these various medians, and in particular, kind of right on that minimum spot for those AA ratings. So obviously, very good improvement from the last couple of years in fiscal year 21. Hopefully, we'll continue to see that improvement in fiscal year 22. But I do think this peer comparative kind of puts that into perspective. You have reached your minimum. you're working your way towards the target, but even then, at the 15% target, you can see, you would be well sort of below these median levels and on the bottom end of the range for the North Carolina AA's. So even once we get to that 15% minimum, doesn't mean that sort of frees us up to start spending down that fund balance. So just wanted to point that out as you're working towards that. And it may be something that going forward, as you continue to improve your financial results, you may want to consider revisiting that policy at some point. Okay, so that covers the general fund operations. On the debt side of things for the general fund, we call this the tax-supported debt outstanding. You all have just, you all have just under $30 million of what we call tax-supported debt outstanding. That's things like streets and sidewalks and parks and rec type projects that have been funded over the years, City Hall. I think what's helpful to note, and certainly that we've talked about over the last couple of years, is historically you can see the growth in your debt service. When I say debt service, that's your annual payment, principal plus interest. You can see the growth that occurred in those annual debt service payments historically. Those payments really peaked out in the years in which you were drawing down your fund balance. Fiscal year 2020 and 2021. Or excuse me, fiscal year 19 and fiscal year 2020. Since that time, there's been some reductions in debt service, which has helped improve the financial results. And it's going to generally projected to stay at roughly that same level over the current budget year, fiscal year 23, and into next budget year, fiscal year 24. After that period of time, you'll start to see some more significant reductions in your annual debt service payments. And notably, by fiscal year 2026, your annual debt service payment will have declined from its current level in fiscal year 23 by over $1.2 million. So that's going to give you all some more flexibility within the budget to consider doing other things with those dollars, or to consider funding capital projects or other initiatives, or continue adding to fund balance. So that's, that continued decline in that debt service is going to present some opportunities for you going forward. I do want to mention on this tax-supported debt, the city has 3 financial policies that it has adopted. The first of which is on a ratio called the 10-year payout ratio. And we're showing that on the right-hand side of page 11. This is a measure of the percentage of your tax-supported debt outstanding that you are paying back in the first 10 years, right? So you have right at $30 million of total tax-supported debt outstanding. You are repaying 86% of that within the next 10 years. So within 10 years, you will have retired 86% of that $30 million of debt outstanding. You're repaying back that debt quickly and allowing yourselves, freeing up capacity for either future projects to be financed or room in your debt service budget. A little more detail on that ratio on page 12. What's important about this is the fact that you're not just issuing debt and not responsibly paying it back. You're paying it back in a very responsible fashion. You have a policy on this ratio that you will maintain at least a minimum of a 55% 10-year payout ratio. Again, y'all are at 86%, well above that policy, and we do have these peer comparatives for each of these ratios. You can see you're in very good shape on this peer comparative. Stack up nicely to other rated cities and towns. The second financial policy, debt policy that you all have is on page 13. This is debt to assessed value. Debt as a percentage, outstanding debt, that roughly $30 million, as a percentage of your overall tax base. And you all, based upon a $2.6 billion tax base, that $30 million represents about 1.15% tax-supported debt outstanding as a percentage of your tax base. you've got a policy not to exceed 2.5%. So very good shape compared to that policy, less than half of your policy level as of fiscal year 23. And again, you can see how you stack up to the national and North Carolina medians. Kind of right in line with those national medians, a little higher than the North Carolina medians, but when we look at the overall ranges, not at an unreasonable spot compared to those ranges. So I think you're in good shape here compared to your policy. Generally stack up fine to folks that are rated nationally and in North Carolina. And again, you're paying back that debt responsibly very quickly. So we're going to see this ratio improve over time as your debt is reduced and your tax base grows. Finally, last ratio, this is set up the same as the others, but instead of debt outstanding, it's focused on your annual payments, those annual principal and interest payments. So your debt service as a percentage of your overall governmental expenditure budget. In fiscal year 23, we've projected that your annual debt service payment, which was roughly $4.8 million overall budget. You have a policy not to exceed 15%. So getting a little closer to that policy level, but you're below it in compliance with the policy level. And again, you can see maybe a little higher than these medians nationally and in North Carolina, but generally within the range of these North Carolina cities and towns. And we know that you're paying back that debt responsibly. We know there's some declines in that, how quickly that falls down to below the 10% level but by 2026. So overall, in compliance with your debt policies, and generally look good or look reasonable compared to your national and North Carolina rated peers on the general fund or tax support side. And keep rolling unless you all have questions. Did want to, oh, yes, sir.
One quick question. Going back to the 10-year payout ratios.
Yes, sir.
Why is it that the NC AAA cities tend to have a lower payout ratio? Are they just a little bit more comfortable supporting long-term debt, or is it just the way it works out?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of factors that play into that. And I think I think it might be a helpful perspective as we talk through this. Let's look at who those North Carolina AAAs are, right? So it's the folks that you would expect, the quote-unquote Big Five, the Charlottes, the Raleighs, Winstons, Greensboros, but they're also some, Asheville, but there's also some areas around those major metropolitan cities, more fast-growing suburb or smaller towns like Apex, Cary, Cary's not a smaller town, but Chapel Hill, Wake Forest around Raleigh, Morrisville. So those are the type of folks that are falling into that AAA category. And I think I would break those up into two categories, right? There's the larger major metropolitan areas that, when they issue debt, are probably issuing longer term debt, right? 20-year type debt. They're probably not doing a lot of shorter term leasing. They have the cash flow to be able to manage that typically. But they're also very active in the debt markets. Those places have established debt plans, so they're constantly sort of replacing the debt that they've issued in the past, which is why you see a lower payout ratio because they're issuing longer term debt. And on these other ratios, you'll see that they have generally more debt outstanding because they're just maintaining that level of debt that they've issued. And then on the flip side, folks like that are sort of growing areas like a Morrisville, a Wake Forest, whom we work with, have had a number of GO bond referendums over the last couple of years. They are growing, so they are funding projects to support that growth. A lot of streets and sidewalks, parks and rec type projects that they're funding through debt issuance. And not uncommon, we tend to see those type of growing places have a higher debt burden as they look to meet the needs of the increasing population. You're not going to build a town hall or a park or widen a street to support the current population. When you're growing that quickly, you're going to do it bigger, which generally results in slightly larger amount of debt outstanding.
Thank you.
Okay. So that's going to take us to the utility profile. And I'm going to hit on this rather quickly. I think y'all are going to have a much larger conversation around utilities later on in your agenda with your rate consultant, Stantec. But I do just want to set it up a little bit for you headed into that. You all, on the water and sewer side, have about $20 million, $27 million of debt currently outstanding of water and sewer utility debt. You have been approved for another revolving loan of about $3.6 million that has not been drawn yet. Factoring that in, it kind of takes you right up to that $30 million level, about the same as the amount of debt that's outstanding on the general fund side. I mean, you can see this debt is paying off over the next 20 years. And like the general fund, there are some declines in debt service in the coming years. I know you all have had conversations, have been planning for the projects that are needed on the water and sewer side, and you're going to get some more information on that later today. But from a credit standpoint, for water and sewer system, and in particular the financials of a water and sewer system, in the credit markets, from the credit perspective in the financial markets, there's really two key ratios that we tend to focus on. And it's for evaluating the financial results. And the first is liquidity. Just like the general fund, very similar to the general fund, it's your cash balances, your fund balance levels. Accounting is a little different for enterprise funds, so we don't call it fund balance, but we look at your unrestricted or current asset cash balance. And we tend to look at this as a percentage of your operating and maintenance expense budget. So, if your revenues declined or went away, how many days or what percentage of the year would you be able to operate this system? And so you all, again, similar to the general fund, with some of the challenges over the last couple of years, had some declines in this measure of your cash as a percentage of your O&M budget. You do have a policy to maintain 50%. Fell below that policy in 2020, but a very nice result in 2021, back in compliance with that policy, and well above it at almost 85% of your O&M budget. So your cash in the water and sewer fund represented, roughly 75% of your water and sewer fund budget. Again, that's back above your policy, and you'll see, you all at that roughly 75%, how you line up to national and North Carolina rated utility systems. We're no longer focused on cities and towns. These are water and sewer utility systems. And you can see, below the medians nationally for the AAA and AA, kind of right in line with that single A national median and right in line with that North Carolina AA median. What I'd point out is, again, kind of like the general fund, with your policy level of 50%, that would kind of put you on the lower end of these various medians or ranges of these rated cities and towns. So again, very good result in 21, back into compliance with that policy, but doesn't necessarily mean that you can start dipping into that cash balance at this point immediately when you compare to others. And I think Stantec's going to have a little more perspective on that later today, but just wanted to set that up for you.
Mitch, if I could interrupt for just
Please.
a second, Mayor. So would you see a floor and a target on this like we did for the general fund? I mean, to me, a floor of 50% and a target of 100% might be appropriate if council decides to go there.
I think that's a very reasonable thing. Policies that we see typically range from 50 to 100%. I'd probably say the most common is around 100% that we see. So I think having that two-stage, 50% minimum, target of 75 to 100%, I think is a very reasonable approach if you choose to do that over time.
Thank you.
Okay? The second thing, the second key ratio that we look at, second financial ratio we look at for water and sewer funds is debt service coverage. And I think we've talked about this over the years, but just very quickly, make sure we all know what we're talking about here. In a utility system, typically the way it's operated is you collect your revenues and you pay your operating expenses first before you pay debt service. Because in order to generate the revenues in the utility system, you have to pay your operating expenses. Those are tied together. If you're not treating sewer, if you're not providing water, you can't bill for it, and then your revenues go away. So what we typically look at is you take your operating revenues coming in minus your operating expenses. That leaves you the amount that's available to pay debt service and to pay capital projects. So very simply, if you have $4 of revenue and $2 of expenses, that leaves you $2 available to pay for debt service and capital. If you have $1 of debt service, $1 of principal and interest, and you had $2 to pay it, that is a 2 times debt service coverage. You could pay for your debt service payment twice from the dollars available that you had to pay for it. That's the concept of debt service coverage. And you all, on the operating side, have actually been improving your debt service coverage since 2018. While there's certainly been some capital investments over the last few years that have pulled that liquidity down, from a cash flow perspective, net revenue available for debt service, you have been increasing that debt service coverage over the last few years and are at a very healthy level there on debt service coverage in fiscal 21 at 2.5 times. You can see that puts you right in line or above all these medians. So this ratio is really a strength for you all in the utility system, and is something that you may be able to take advantage of going forward if you think about taking on new revolving loans or things like that. You have some room under this ratio to do that. You have a policy to maintain a minimum of 1.25 debt service coverage, and you all, again, 2.5 times are well above that. So overall, I think this ratio has been and certainly improved to a position of strength for the overall utility system, water and sewer system. We do have the city's financial policies in the back in an appendix if you're interested in looking at those, but that's what we wanted to share with you all today. Again, happy to answer any questions. Congratulations on the 21 audit and the 21 results. I think certainly seen that as a market improvement over fiscal 20.
I have a comment, actually sort of a question. As I understand your presentation, our general and utility fund balances are within our established target rate level, but we're below the AA cities in North Carolina. Is that a correct statement?
Yes, sir.
And the second part of that is while we may be within our target, our established target, we still need to improve beyond what our target level is to become more competitive with, not competitive, I don't like, but more in line.
More in line with those other means. Yes, sir. That's a very fair way to say that. I would never stand up here and tell you what decisions you should make. That's a policy decision. Sure. But I can give you the information to say that if you wanted to be more in line with some of these other median levels, certainly having a higher level of unassigned fund balance.
And more in line doesn't just mean that we're more in line with them, but it makes us more sound in our financial.
More sound financially. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Gives you more of a cushion.
So you may want to consider keeping your floor at 10% and your target at 20% for the general rather than 15.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Well, that's sort of where I was getting at. Our targets are lower than it probably should be. We need to consider raising that target.
I mean, certainly from my perspective, from a credit perspective, that would improve the city's overall credit. And I know you're balancing that with other needs as well. So, but I think certainly if that's something y'all are comfortable, choose to do so, that would certainly improve things from a financial perspective when we're talking to creditors.
I understand from the LGC, peers our size are typically 40 to 50%. So,
Yeah.
you know, this is overall AA, which can be smaller in larger cities. But I understand the LGC, when we get our audits done to get off their unit assistance list, would like to see us more, at least half of what our peers are. That's why, you know, that would be in the 20s someplace. I think 20 is a reasonable target going forward, Mayor, to see what council wants to do.
I think that makes sense. In one note, Tim, I know we've talked about this, is the LGC that sort of what they look at is a statutory calculation, which is a little different sometimes than unassigned fund balance. And auditors were still here, and I'll certainly defer to Catherine to explain that if I needed to. But it's just a very specific calculation that the LGC does that doesn't necessarily tie out to this unassigned fund balance, which is an accounting calculation that your policy is based upon. So just when you're hearing those numbers, fund balance percentage numbers, those aren't always the same. Like Mr. Salmon mentioned, you see the medians of these rating categories are a little lower than that 40 to 50%.
That's important. I'm glad that you made that distinction and brought that up, that it is a different calculation, using the same term but defining it differently.
That's right, and in your policy does refer to available fund balance and then defines it as originally unreserved, undesignated, which is the old accounting standard, which is now unassigned. The North Carolina available fund balance calculation is a measure of cash and accounts payable, accounts receivable, and things like that. Catherine's shaking her head at me, so I'm getting it right. So it's more of a cash style calculation as opposed to a fund balance.
We have to consider, and that is, well, the mayor said it's not a competition. Other companies are looking, and when your financial health is really strong, they're more likely to move towards you than someplace else. So from an economic development perspective, it's healthy to have good financial performance measures.
Any other comments? Okay, sir, thank you very much. It's a very informative presentation. And thank you for the work you all do as well.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you for having us. Appreciate it. Glad I was able to make it.
Thanks, Mitch. Yeah.
Ms. Catherine?
So we scheduled Catherine for 15 to 20 minutes ago, so, or 25 minutes. She's going to try to
We'll go
make it
fast.
short, but so we can not necessarily lose out in the strategic planning discussion. But if you would like more details on what she's about to present, we can maybe bring that back tomorrow.
So, since I'm going to go through these pretty speedily, I'm just going to give you a spoiler alert. So, you know, we do the budget planning process, and, every day after the new fiscal year, we're looking at not just what the departments are doing, what they're spending, and what revenues are coming in. We also look at the economic conditions, political conditions, things like that that could impact revenues or expenses, inflation, things of that nature. So I'm just going to tell you right now that we're on target, okay? And that's the results that we're going to go through. And I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly so we can get y'all back on schedule. And we certainly appreciate our auditors and our financial advisors coming because I think they give us real valuable information. And it's good to hear outside third parties tell us that, we've got things on track and things are going in the right direction. So I think that's certainly good news for the council to hear from third parties. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over the money that's coming in the door, the money that's going out the door. We're going to talk a little bit about projects, and we're going to talk a little bit about fund balance. So we do this comparison for 6 months, so 12/31, from this fiscal year to the prior fiscal year. This particular slide talks about general fund. We had $24.2 million coming in the door. Same time in the prior fiscal year was about $26 million. Now, we're about $1.8 million less than we were in the prior fiscal year. That is primarily due to borrowing. We did 2 large loan borrowings in fiscal '22 that we did not have in fiscal '23. So we compare our budget to actual, and so we use 12/31 because it's a nice point through the year. It's 50%. And I would say we have this rated in terms of what the budget amount is. So, of course, property tax is on the top of the list, and it goes down in descending order. And I will say your biggest number coming in the door to fund the general fund is property tax. We're at 73% at 12/31, which we should be. We do get a lot of collections in January because people are trying to beat the interest. So you should be at property tax in that 70%, so we're right on target. Sales tax is 26% because that's that accrual calculation. So through 12/31, we've only gotten the actual retail sales that have come in the door for July, August, and September. This catches up, but we're on target when we look at how much money comes in the door for sales tax. It's round about $1 million, which it should be, so we're on target to meet our budget for that. And so bottom line, we are about 52% of the general fund, what we have budgeted, we've collected. And again, that's really where we should be. Went too far. Utility funds, collections, comparing the two fiscal years, $11.7 million for the current, $10.5 in the prior. We're up about $1.1 million. So that is to be expected. And again, the charges are in order of the largest to the smallest. Sewer and water charges, of course, are what drive the utility fund. So we're on target. And then when we compare the budget to fiscal year, $24.2 million, we've collected 11.7, we're about 48.4, and we should be around 50%, so I think we're on target there. Stormwater, it's one of our smaller, it is the smallest utility fund or enterprise fund we have, 1.1 million. So we've collected about $80,000 more than we did in the prior fiscal year, so we're on target moving up. And then comparing budget to actual for the current fiscal year, 1.9 million, 1.1, we're at 58%. A lot of that's getting driven by the fact we did the loan borrowing in September. So that 117% is driving it up. But the largest portion of your money is from your stormwater fee. We're at 49%, which is about where we should be this time of year. Downtown district, it's primarily driven by property taxes. We are up about $3,000 in comparison to the prior year. When we look at the budget to actual, $117,000 in budget, we've collected about 66. We're at about 56.92%. That number is relatively on target. Again, property tax works the same way. It probably should be a little bit higher, but I fully expect because of the amount, we're not talking about $17 million in property tax like we are in the general fund, it's $117,000. I would fully expect that this number will be up to around 95% by the time we get to the end of the fiscal year. Occupancy tax, comparatively, we're about $10,000 more than we were in the prior fiscal year. We've collected about $583,000. Looking at budget to actual, $1.1 million budget, $583,000, we're about 49%, so we're right at that 50% mark, which is where I would expect us to be. And then comparing total actual collections, we've collected about $38.5 million in revenue compared to last year with $38.4. We're about $155,000 to the positive 12/31 comparing both fiscal years. And then we're going to take a quick look at the operating expenditures. So I compare it by the funds, and we rank it. We have personnel first because personnel is our largest cost in our budget. We should be around that 50% mark. The one thing I will comment on when you look at the general fund, $14.4 million through 12/31 up to $12.5 million. So you see the 56 and the 47% difference. Well, just remember how desperate our personnel situation was last year. So, we struggled to fill positions. We had a lot of lapsed salaries. We have actually been able to fill some of those positions, so that's why we are running a little bit more in our personnel expense. But overall, like in the general fund, we've spent about 23.6 million out of a $46 million budget, about 51%, and that's really where we should be. And then in the utility fund, we've spent about 7.5 million, about 31% of the budget's been spent, but we have a lot of capital needs, and we're still having a lot of supply chain issues and a lot of issues trying to get people and timing, and there are some really large capital projects, so that drives that number down for us.
Catherine, could I interrupt for a minute? On the personnel issue, please confirm that we're not necessarily overspending our personnel, that ARPA funding will make up some of that
That is
budgeted
correct.
funding.
That's right. And so these numbers, I have not worked the ARPA calculation in. So what's going to happen is we're going to reduce those personnel expenditures out of the operating funds, and then they're going to actually get placed in that special revenue fund for ARPA funding where the 8.8 is sitting. I have not done those calculations yet. That's actually on my to-do list for the next couple of weeks. And so we look at the stormwater fund, $1 million, and it's a $1.9 million budget. We're about 51% spent. Downtown district, a $41,000 expenditure for $117,000, about 35% of that budget spent. And let's see, occupancy tax fund, about 28% of the budget. I included the general fund capital reserve and the utility capital fund reserve just as memo information, but you all understand what those funds are for. And then we do a recap where I look at personnel. I total all of those operating funds. So like personnel, out of $29 million budget, we're about 57% spent. And then when you look at the total budget, the $75.5 million, we've spent about 33.3, and that's about 44% spent. So we're kind of like in that halfway range, that 50% range. And then when you look at it by fund, again, you can see like the general fund, we're about 51% spent with a total overall average of about 44%. Okay. So I also do a slide where I compare I've given you revenues, I've given you expenditures, now I put them together. And so I think really what I try to point out is the green to me is like positive cash flow. Red would be negative cash flow. So for revenue, we're in the general fund, 24.29 collected out of 46.5. It's 52% of the budget. So that's green. We're ahead of the curve. Expenditures, 23.6 out of the 46.6 budget. We're spent about 51. So you see you've taken in 52%, you spent about 51. And so overall, we're about 656,000 to the good. And the reason, part of the reason is on the difference with your general fund. There's a lot of loan proceeds that are in there, and there was something else, and I can't think of it right now, but that was the difference for the prior fiscal year. Oh, I know what it was. It was lapsed salaries because you didn't spend that money. That's another big piece that's making that number appear larger in the prior fiscal year. In the utility fund, we're to positive cash flow, about $44,151,000. Stormwater fund, we're about $148,000 positive in cash flow. Downtown district, $25,000 positive cash flow. Occupancy tax, $250,000. And for all funds, we've taken in about 38.8. We've spent about 33.3 as of December 31. So we're about 5.2 million to the good. Comparatively to last year, it was 5.5 million, but again, I'll point out there was a little over $3 million in loan proceeds last year at this same time. So we're going to take a quick talk about project funds. So what I've been talking to you about these last few minutes has been operating funds, okay? The council also authorizes grant project funds, special revenue funds, or capital project funds when we have things that last more than a year. Operating funds go from July 1 to June 30. Special revenue or capital project funds that fall under the grant project fund ordinance in the general statute, they last more than a year. So Tim asked me to include this slide about existing tax-supported and utility debt. Mitch has given you a really good overview. So my slide basically is showing that on the governmental type debt that we still have outstanding is about 29.5 million. And he asked me to break it down so you could see what it is that we spent the money on. And it's kind of portioned out, like buildings and improvements. And buildings make up, about 50%. So that would be like City Hall, Paramount, W.A. Foster, the Bryan Multi-Sports Complex. Streets, about 24%, so that would be like the street paving bonds that the council did. Streetscape would be another example. We had the settlement at 2%, rolling stock, so that's like police cars, fire trucks, dump trucks, backhoes, things of that nature, about 20%. And then IT needs at about 2%. On the enterprise debt, most of that debt that's still outstanding is related to sewer work, about 61%, and about 23% related to water. And Tim, did you want to say anything about
Nope,
this
I
slide?
appreciate that.
All right. So I just give you a snapshot summary of the projects, the budget, as well as what has been spent as of 12/31 of 22, which now council, you are getting that monthly project report. So this same information basically is captured there. This is just split up into governmental. This is governmental and enterprise type projects. And then I give you one that is enterprise only. And then at the very bottom, I do a recap. So we've got about 74.6 million outstanding in project budget. We've spent about 45.2 million as of 12/31 of 22. And so we're going to talk real quickly about fund balance appropriations for this fiscal year. The largest amount is in the general fund. It's 1.1 million that the council has approved in fund balance appropriation. The total for all our operating funds is 1.7 million. The vast majority of that is all related to PO rollovers, which, as you all are aware, we had a lot of supply chain issues, so we couldn't get goods filled, we couldn't get contracts completed, so we had to roll a lot of stuff over. And of course, that's going to come out of your 23 fund balance. Okay. Then I just did a slide that just talks about, so, Mitch has been talking about like unassigned fund balance. This is a little snippet out of the preliminary draft for the 21 audit that you all will be getting here shortly to talk about your fund balance. And as Mitch said, available fund balance according to the LGC is this calculation. We're not going to go over it, but you at least have that there that you can look at. And so my slide is talking about available fund balance. So the LGC puts out a memo every year where they talk about cash and available fund balance. That's the little memo, and they have it on a dashboard now so you can pull it. And so what I've done is I've just updated this to show what the statutory calculation of the city's available fund balance in 2021 is 5 million. And so as you can see, it's gone up. We were at the 9% and we've gone up to the 12%, and kind of the unofficial floor, if you will, for the LGC is 8%. So we are on the rise, and I can tell you, even the unadjusted 22, which I gave you all a snapshot of that, I think it was December I did my presentation for council, that we expect that number to go up. Now, I can't promise you that it's going to be 15%, but I think we're well on our way to seeing that number increase. So I'm very happy about that, and just thankful to the management and the staff, because if they didn't do their part, we couldn't make these numbers happen. So we're real thankful for all the work that they do. And then my last slide is, this is basically everything I talked about today. We've talked about the budget, and as you can see, it's a balanced budget, revenues and expenditures. That's what we're required by law. And then we've got the actual results as of 12/31/22. The only one that's showing a red is the utility fund capital reserve, but we had to appropriate some money for some projects. But that is a quarterly distribution, so it will get to the 1.5 million, so that will be in the positive. But overall, all the other results, we are, as of 12/31, 5.2 million to the good. And again, I point out, we've collected about 50% of the revenues. We've spent about 51, but overall, we're 5.2 million to the good. So I think it's, a testament to management, department heads, and all the staff of the hard work that they do to kind of keep us on track and maintain that budget, because that is our operating plan. And of course, that's what y'all are getting ready to work on, and I say that's the most important document that y'all prepare and give us guidance on every year, and we appreciate those hard decisions you have to make. Be glad to take any questions if you have any.
Catherine, I have a question. Do you know offhand what dollar amount or percentage of the $25 million employee expense is attributed to ARPA? Or what portion of ARPA money pays for that?
Well, okay, so we started using ARPA in fiscal '22. So I'm going to use, depending on what we've got keyed in, I can't take, probably my guess is going to be we're going to use up about 60% of ARPA in fiscal '23, but we're also going to use some of it when I go to adjust the books in '22 as well, because the important part of that is we need to get out from underneath compliance requirements. So we're going to use up all of the ARPA by fiscal '23, but my guess is maybe about 60-70% will be in fiscal '23.
So
Ballpark.
I think the bottom line is we won't have ARPA money after the '23 budget.
That's right.
So we have to look beyond ARPA funding to revenue streams to fill that gap.
Right, that's right. And it will be, I will say, that because it was not all planned for in '23, it will give you some reserves, in a sense, that can be used to fund other projects in the '24 budget.
If I recall correctly, it was about $1.5 million we didn't program or budget of the ARPA funding in FY '22, FY '23, that we would have saved for FY '23, '24, the upcoming budget. So if Catherine accounts for it all this year, as we do all the documentation, that'll end up being in fund balance that we can then move forward into the next budget cycle as required.
Well, any other questions, comments? You spoke to the support and input from the various departments and your own staff. I want to also say that we understand that there's a lot of work that goes into your finance presentation and the daily finance accounting and so forth. We've struggled in the last 3 years with this whole overall financial situation. And I know your staff, your departments, or sister departments have provided input and worked with you. And from speaking on behalf of the council, I want to express my appreciation to you and your staff and everyone else that has been a part of this. But the mission is not complete. We have to continue to go on. So I look forward to future reports and so forth.
Absolutely. We're on track. We've already talked about scheduling, so yes, we're looking forward to getting all that behind us. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Catherine, will the next contract be at the next meeting in March?
That's my plan.
Yep.
I've had preliminary discussions with the auditors, and what we've talked about is like trying to get a finish date of July 31 or August 31, and then with a tentative date on 23 of 12/31 of '23.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we're obviously behind timeline here for about half an hour. Octavius is going to come in because he has ClearPoint Consultant online, so that his presentation on the strategic plan will be shortened, and maybe we can pick up the rest of it tomorrow, where we opened up some time at 11 o'clock. Yeah. So, Octavius, please, Mayor.
Good morning, Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, staff, and council members. As Tim said, we will abbreviate our presentation this morning, but I think it's extremely important that you understand the value that our strategic planning brings to the table. It's because of your leadership that the staff takes into consideration when we start our budget planning, when we start our operations, when we meet with each resident throughout the city. Our strategic plan mission, which was established by you, the council, in February of 2017, the city provides services, promotes equality, and protects the well-being of residents and citizens for better quality of life every day. That's the messaging that each employee receives when they join the city of Goldsboro through their orientation. So it's your vision that we are directing. So know that, having said that, I like starting with the end in mind. So if you don't take anything else away, take this. We thank you for your leadership. We thank you for your sacrifices that you make each and every day on behalf of the citizens of Goldsboro. But without question, over the next 6 to 12 to 18 months, we will need your support. We'll need your leadership. We'll need your engagement in working on this strategic plan initiative. Tim will probably close on tomorrow with some comments and suggestions regarding our strategic planning and where we're headed. But just know that we without question want to invest in you. And I'll talk about that investment on tomorrow. So if I may introduce to you our business partner, Mara Rivera. Mara is with ClearPoint Strategy. She is the senior customer succession manager. Mara and I have worked together for the past year, and we've had a business relationship with ClearPoint. They provide the software, the performance management software that we're using today. So Mara, welcome to the 2022-23 Council Retreat.
Thank you, Octavius, and thank you to the City Council for having me here today.
So this morning what we will do is we'll talk briefly about the public view of the strategic plan, and we will talk about the internal business tool that each of the department heads, the participating department heads use on a daily basis. But understand our strategic planning, our strategic plan dashboard is a moving document. It changes regularly because our city's needs change regularly. So Mara, if you would share our strategic plan metric. You see the public view on our website each and every day, but what we're going to show you is what you don't often see, which is my desktop, where I work, where I reside. And this is where we do a lot of work with ClearPoint. This is very similar to what you see, but it's in a data performance set. So I hope you enjoy this virtual tour of my office. Mara, if you don't mind, well, I tell you what, just jump in, Mara, and start from here, and we'll go from there.
Hey, Mara, if I could interrupt for a second, maybe an example or two from here rather than as many as we're gonna do, and then focus on the CIP aspect of it that council wouldn't see otherwise. Does that make sense, Octavius?
It does, but I think it's important that the council understand the format, the foundation for our strategic plan and how it's laid out so they can better, such as the goals that we have and how those goals associate with the measures that are in place. So scroll up.
I'll jump in and provide that overview very quickly so that we can move this along. So the internal tool that your organization uses to track your strategic plan is called ClearPoint Strategy. It's a performance management and strategy management tool. It's divided by a series of scorecards or folders where you can have all the different aspects of your strategic plan and relate those different elements of your strategic plans to each other. So in this main page, we have housed the goals that Octavius spoke to that were developed in 2017. And we have a number of metrics that are aligned with each of these goals, and they are owned by the various departments of the city of Goldsboro. When we kind of jump into any of the goals, we can see a list of all of the metrics that are assigned to them. And we can also see that relationship within this top level view. For the purposes of just moving along a little bit quickly, I can go ahead and jump to our department view so that Octavius can speak to maybe one or two examples, and then we can talk a little bit about the CIP initiative. So one of the first departments that we can navigate to very easily is perhaps police department, Octavius?
Yes, that's a perfect one to start with. Why? Because our crime rate is extremely important. Our police chief and I sit down and have been sitting down on a yearly basis, and the trends are that we take away from here, because what we do, the benchmark is to national violence and national property. So when we look at our metrics to determine where we are in comparison to those metrics, it tells a compelling story. Mara, will you go to the graph itself? Yes. So here, what you'll see, so in 20, when you look at Goldsboro violence and Goldsboro property, in 20, the goal is to be above the national property. This is what we're tracking, national property. The goal is to be above. But if you see here, in 2022 specifically, we are above in violence, but as far as property, we are below. So we are pending numbers from the national on both national violence and property. So you will see a blue indicator here. But what that trend tells you is that there's a significant need in our police department for staff. We are lacking when it comes to investigation because this is our crime rate cleared. So we're not clearing as many cases as we have in the past. You could just see the correlation throughout the years. And the chief and I sit down and study these numbers, and again, they're based on national numbers. So this is just one way that we can come close to predicting what the trend may change to. On a better note, Mara, would you transition?
Octavius, just to clarify, we're below the national average for property and violent. I think you said earlier we were above in violent. That in 2021, that maroon line there is above the national property line, but it really should be above the maroon line at top, correct?
This is the national violence.
Right. So
Yeah,
we want to be above that for clearing violent crime.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I meant to refer to the national property.
Right.
Where we are not performing as we should. But yes, that is a very correct statement. One measure, what I call a light community measure. Mara, would you transition to excellence in government and look at the Paramount Theater?
I'm sorry, Octavius. The sound is cutting out a little bit. Which scorecard would you like me to navigate to?
Paramount, and then we'll come back to downtown.
Okay.
We are excited about this metric because, as you know, the Paramount Theater had to deal with a lot of constraints regarding attendance and programming in their over the COVID years. Well, as you know, we're low now, and we're transitioning out of COVID carefully. But here, what you'll see is, and what we're measuring here is youth under 18. To get our younger children in middle school and high school engaged in the arts. So what our director has done, he's moved this bar. The goal is, the target is 35%, and we are above 60% in engaging the youth in our community. And did I document that correct?
That is correct.
Mic on? Is the mic on?
This was really the first year that the school system was allowing field trips back to the Paramount and other places. We were able to engage that. We've been intentional in our programming so that we've been able to to really create programming that's targeting the young people, and we've been encouraging them to be part of what we do. As we see in the data there, that the statistics about the benefits to young people to be involved in the arts are tremendous, and so we made that a target. We have other things that we're interested in creating metrics for that would be, in addition to this. But this trend is remarkable. I was surprised by by the data that we had for this past year. I didn't want to make that the target again when we had such an extraordinary burst of activity. But we're hoping for that, and so we're taking a measured approach to next year, but continuing with the programming that we're doing right now.
Good stuff. Thank you so much. Mara, would you transition to downtown development, return on investment?
Octavius, can we go through some of these metrics tomorrow and move into the CIP? We've got about, we're on time right now if you were to end, so if 5 minutes
right.
more or something, and then we'll hit the rest of it tomorrow, Mayor, if that's all right, because we have other contractors lined up to talk to you that may or may not be available with a delay.
So, we're done?
Talk CIP if you would. You wanted to show that aspect of it with Mara that you can't.
Absolutely. Okay, so
Is the young lady who is part of your presentation, is she, I don't want to admit her inadvertently.
she's a big part of this. But the capital improvement plan, we're really excited because we're right at the cutting edge of developing something that's really near and dear to the city's heart. If you look at Sugar Land, Texas, their 5-year CIP plan, you'll see where we're headed from a CIP standpoint. Right here, what Mara is showing you is all the capital, and this is, I need to say this is a work in progress. This is not completed. So this is not something we would promote on the public view. But when you look at the source of funds, the general fund, the utility fund, occupancy, finance, these are all of our fund sources that are coming in to the city of Goldsboro. And then we're tracking the uses of funds as well. Land improvement, land acquisition, planning, engineering. We're not only tracking the infrastructure on top of the ground, but we're now tracking the infrastructure costs below the ground. So that's big for the city of Goldsboro. And at a glance, and we can abbreviate all of this, Mara, would you click on the source of funds pie chart? So here at a glance, we can see what percentage is represented by each fund. So I think we're headed in the right direction. Or would you click on the use of funds? Same here. So we can see here that there's just a lot of opportunity to provide from a presentation standpoint where fund sources are going, and it coincides with everything we're doing from our consultants, our finance department, our budgeting. So it's a good business tool to use. Really hate we have to abbreviate this, but we do, and we will continue on tomorrow if.
Octavius, is there anything you'd like Mara to comment upon why we have her available? Because I understand she's not available tomorrow.
All right. Your platform.
I was essentially just here to kind of provide a little bit more context if there were questions about the tool. this has been a work in progress. ClearPoint has multiple use cases that Octavius is, leveraging for the city of Goldsboro. There's a lot more that can be done with our metrics, with our charts. We really just want this to be something that you all can really use to have that information available to you to make your reporting easier and to really facilitate these conversations. Octavius and I will continue working on the capital improvement plan. And, some of the things that we didn't get to talk about is just some of the way that this will be kind of an automated process. It's going to be a lot lighter in terms of workload to manage this. So a lot to come, but I don't want to take too much of your time. I appreciate the time that you all have already given me and really appreciate kind of the partnership that the City of Goldsboro has with ClearPoint, and looking forward to continuing to help you all with your success in your strategic plan and having a place for you all to manage your information.
Thank you. Any questions? Excellent.
Okay, public utility rates and system development fees. We have David Hyder from Stantec.
Good morning. Again, Dave Hyder with Stantec. Pleasure to be here, Mayor, council members. We've had a lot of technical discussion on numbers that continue with this presentation. Feel free to interject and ask any questions as I go through, because this is pretty technical in nature, just in terms of the discussion. I'm going to go over first. I do have two presentations. The first presentation is going to be on the cost of service results. And so in terms of our agenda, I'm going to talk just about the approach in conducting the cost of service, what it entails, kind of the framework that it provides. Then we'll look at the water utility analysis, sewer utility analysis, and then I'll wrap up with some summary findings. So just to start off, there's really two key components to a rate study analysis, a comprehensive rate study analysis. And the first is a financial plan, which essentially develops what does it cost to provide utility service on an annual basis, and what are our revenues to cover those costs. And that's typically done, again, on an annual basis. It's completed as part of your budget process. It's what the city's done over the last several years. And it essentially culminates in a rate increase. You'll often say, well, we're going to do a 5% rate increase, and we're going to increase rates 5% across the board. So water and sewer rates, all rates go up at that percentage. The other component, which we're going to talk about today, is the cost of service analysis. And that's typically examining the cost to provide service for the various classes of customers. And you look at this more periodically, typically on a 3 to 5 year basis. It's been quite a while since the city's conducted a cost of service analysis. And you typically use a test year of actual costs. So rather than looking forward, we're looking at a specific actual year of costs. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Is I'm going to go through the cost of service analysis. And what that provides then is a framework to consider potential changes to your rate structure, how you actually charge as we go forward into the fiscal year 24 budget. So starting off, this is your current water rate structure. So this is how you charge for water service currently. On the water side, you have a minimum charge. So there's a fixed charge that's based on meter size. And then you have volumetric rates. And there's 4 categories of rates. You have inside the city and outside the city. And then you can see, obviously, the minimum fixed charges. We're going to focus today on the volumetric rates for both water and sewer. You can see you have 4 categories of rates. So there's different customer classes. You have inside and outside, so where customers are located. And then you have general service and industrial bulk. And industrial bulk customers are those that are charged a lower rate, and those are those accounts that use 12.5 million gallons per month or more. And so you can see when you're an industrial customer, you pay less. Unless you're outside the city, this is obviously the lowest rate. So that's how you currently charge within your water rate structure. You do maintain agreements with towns outside the city, and per those agreements, they pay the lowest published water rate. So they're currently paying the $3.30, so the industrial bulk inside city rate. Yes?
Is there any statutory relationship between those rates? I.e., does one have to be a percentage of the other by statute?
No, there's not. Yep. And it's a good point. That's essentially what we're looking at today is how do we have those ratios between those various rates and how do we appropriately set those? So just to give you a little bit of background, this is how much volume of water is sold within each of those rates. So you can see the vast majority of your water volumes are sold inside city general service, about 1 billion gallons in fiscal year 22. Very little in terms of outside city general service, and then industrial at about 413 million gallons, and then industrial outside at about 246 million gallons. That gives you a sense for the distribution of your customers in the usage. Similarly, when we look at the revenues, vast majority is coming obviously from inside city general service, 3.3 million in water, very little, again, outside city general service, and then corresponding industrial inside and industrial outside, both at about a little bit over $1 million in terms of revenues. So then summing it up, this just shows a summary of the total volumes of water sold in fiscal year 22. You've got about 1.6 billion gallons sold. You can see the distribution again of the volumes amongst your customer classes. And then that's revenues just from the volumetric rates. So this doesn't include miscellaneous charges and the minimum charges of $5.8 million for water. So that's the distribution. So that's the background on the water side. Now I want to talk about how we get into the cost of service, and I'm going to try to keep this pretty high level, but essentially when you provide water service, you have a water system, and it has these various functions. You have a treatment plant, which takes water from a source of supply, you treat it, you put it out into the transmission system, so the larger lines that transmit the water throughout the system. Then you have a distribution system, which takes the water and takes it to the homes and businesses and things of that sort. Those are generally the smaller pipes. You have some storage associated with that. And then you have customer-related costs. So you have customer meter reading, billing, things of that sort. And what we do in the cost of service analysis is we look at what does it cost on a test year to provide each of these functional cost components. And then we can take those cost components and say, well, given a bulk customer compared to a general service customer, what components of those system costs do they use in terms of needing to provide service? And so what we've done here, this is the cost of service results for fiscal year 22. And it takes the cost from a test year, so the actual expenditures in fiscal year 22 for water, and it puts them into those buckets of functions. And while this is summarized here, we go through excruciating detail, line item by line item, allocating all the operating cost, all of the debt, all of the capital to these various functions. So what you can see is your most expensive cost is related to treatment and source of supply at $4.8 million. Maintenance of the transmission system, which are the larger lines, is about $800,000. Maintenance of the distribution system at 1.2, and then you have your customer-related costs. So a total of about 7.4 million in water. And then what we can do is essentially look at, okay, you have a differentiation between general service and bulk customers, and how do we look at that ratio that we were talking about earlier in terms of those rates? And what we've done here is the customer-related costs are essentially funded through that minimum charge, so those can be excluded. When we look at the total cost to provide general service, it's the 6.8 million. And then when we ratio that and say, well, in reality, when we're serving an industrial and bulk customer, they don't really use the distribution system. They're connecting primarily to the transmission system. And so that would be a thing that we could essentially remove from the equation and say, well, when we look at a ratio of a general service customer, so somebody that uses the entire system, going through the distribution system, the transmission, the treatment, and in relation to that industrial bulk, it's about 82%. So that gives us a ratio we can look at and say, well, it costs us about 82% of what it typically would cost us at 100% to serve a general service customer. And so I'll show you how that plays out, and hopefully this ties it together. So this, again, is just a summary of your current water rates. So you can see the 4 classes of rates. You have the inside, outside, general service. You have industrial, bulk, inside, and outside city. You can see the current rates as they stand today for fiscal year 23. And then this next line is essentially the ratios that are currently applied. So outside city is 2 times when it's general service, and then you ratio your inside to outside based on these percentages currently. So you can see right now 82% is used for industrial bulk inside the city, which is consistent with what we found in the cost of service. But the outside city industrial is actually only 74% of the inside city industrial rate. And so there is a finding there in terms of what we would recommend is considering changing that rate ratio as you go forward, considering the fiscal year 24 budget, because of the fact that it's currently set below the cost of service. So I'll pause there real quick. That's an important takeaway. Is that connecting, making sense? Essentially, we're saying that you're not charging enough as a ratio for industrial bulk outside the city for water.
Comment.
Yes.
In my meetings I attend outside of Goldsboro, I keep hearing that the General Assembly this year will address the issue of varied rates. You have anything to comment on that?
Yeah, I haven't heard, that's been a subject for quite some time in terms of whether they're going to address that or not, but I don't know if that's actually going to happen or not. But you're right, that is something that's been talked about, whether 2 times can just be used or if you'd have to justify that in some way.
That would have a big impact on our revenue, and of course it would affect us having to look at our rates even further.
Correct. I believe they will allow some differential. It's just whether you would have to, if you could do 2 times, if it would have to be something less than that based on a calculation. I think they'll still allow it because it's industry practice. Essentially, when you are providing service outside of your boundaries, there's risk that you're taking on. You know, you don't have the taxing authority outside the city, so you're taking on the environmental, the legal, all those risks and providing that service outside of your jurisdiction. So there is, within the industry and within standards, a basis for justifying it. But similar to what I'm going to talk about next, which is system development fees, I wouldn't be surprised if some legislation comes out that defines specifically how you have to calculate that. Yep. Water. Now we can talk about sewer, and it gets more complicated. You don't have a minimum charge on the sewer side, but you do have a lot of different volumetric rates. So you essentially have 8 categories of rates inside and outside the city. So you've got the general and the service, the industrial bulk, but then you also have general service capitalized and industrial bulk capitalized. And these have, taken place over a number of years as you've developed your rate structure. But you can see the volumetric rates here. So the capitalized rates are lower than the regular rates. And my understanding is, while it's not 100% clear, the basis for those is that at one point in time, there were customers that made capital contributions to the system and therefore got reduced rates. But that basis, and that happened quite a while ago, so the basis isn't 100% clear. But you do, similar to water, you do maintain agreements with towns, and per those agreements, they pay the capitalized sewer outside city rate. So they're paying the $7.76 currently for the towns. So similar analysis, just in terms of where the volumes are. Again, biggest sewer producer is essentially general service inside city, about 1 billion gallons. You can see that you actually don't have any customers that fall in the inside industrial category or in the capitalized sewer inside city. So a little bit in terms of the general service and industrial outside the city, but you do have a fair amount of volume that's at the capitalized rates, with the largest being the capitalized sewer at the industrial rate. Similarly, revenues, as you'd expect, they're in line with the volumes. So again, 6.2 million for general service inside city, and then you can see the distribution. And then a summary here. Total volumes of sewage, 1.5 billion gallons in fiscal year 22. Total revenues, about 10.2 million. And then you can see the various distributions of where those revenues are coming from. So we do the exact same type of analysis on the sewer side. So we've functionalized the sewer expenses, the budgets, the operating expenditures, the debt service, and the capital. Essentially 3 main categories: treatment, transmission, and collection. So treating the sewage, so out in the collection system, you're collecting it. This is the big lines, the transmission lines. to take it to the treatment plant for treatment. And so when we did the analysis here, you can see again that the biggest component is your treatment cost, $6.9 million for fiscal year 22 for sewer treatment. Conveyance at 1.4, collection, so those are the smaller collection lines at 3.2. You have some customer-related costs for a total of $12 million in terms of fiscal year 22. We do the same analysis in terms of looking at industrial and bulk. They're generally connecting to the bigger lines, so we're excluding the collection system costs. And so the ratio there would be 72%. Similar to what we calculate on the water side at the 82, this would say 72% when we're looking at an industrial bulk customer in comparison to a general service customer. And so how this plays out, again, more complicated because you have the 8 categories, but you can see again the rates that are currently charged. And then these are the current ratios that are in place right now. So you've got the 2 times for the outside city. Your industrial customers are at 89% of the inside city rates. And then when you look at the capitalized, it ranges from 44 to 40% within these categories. And so based on our analysis, what we determined was instead of 89%, we think it should be 72% for your industrial bulk customers. And the nuance here is essentially what we think you should do as you move forward, and just have to figure out exactly how to do it, would be to simplify the rate structure, and that over time, essentially phase out those capitalized rates. As I mentioned, the justification for them is somewhat vague, and it would be appropriate, in our opinion, to consolidate it down to a more simplified rate structure, because quite honestly, it's very difficult to follow in terms of all the different categories of how people are charged and the basis for those charges. If you went to something like this, you'd then have a rational basis to say this is why we charge what we charge in this simplified structure, and you could put people into those specific buckets. And so, in conclusion, our cost of service analysis does reveal that we think you could consolidate and make some adjustments to your water and sewer rate structures. We've had some ratios now that would essentially be appropriate. So on the water side, we think the industrial bulk outside city rate is below the cost of service. If you remember, it's at 74%. We think it should be at 82%. On the sewer side, there is limited basis for continuing with those capitalized rates. And as I just mentioned, I think it would be appropriate to essentially consolidate to a simpler structure where essentially you'd have those 4 categories of rates, the general service, industrial, inside and outside. But what we're talking about today is essentially just providing a framework that would then roll forward into the budget process. So for fiscal year 24, you could begin adjusting some of these rates. We wouldn't recommend that mid-year or something like that you change the rates. It makes sense to go forward with a framework like this. So if you're considering a 5% increase next year, you could factor in the fact that you'd be changing the rate structure to some degree. But finally, we do need to consider the fact that there are some customers that are paying relatively low rates, those capitalized industrial rates. And if you immediately shifted them to just an industrial rate, at the 72% even, they would potentially see really sizable increases. And so it's taken a long time to get into this structure, and it's going to take some time to unwind it. So it's not uncommon for communities to phase into cost of service over time to make those types of adjustments. So with that, I would be happy to take any questions.
Sir, I have a question.
Yes.
Just for clarification, does the water and sewer cost include the debt?
It does.
Just wanted to clarify that.
Yep, so we looked at fiscal year 22 all-in costs. Yep.
Thank you. Any other questions? So thank you. Something we're going to have to take up here very shortly in terms of your recommendations.
Certainly.
So now we'll roll into the system development fee.
Yep.
For your consideration.
Keep going. Oh, there it is. Okay, perfect. All right, so now I'm going to talk about water and sewer system development fees. And just going to give you a little bit of background. I know that these are not as familiar in the city. So provide some background, talk about the approach in terms of how we've calculated the system development fees, show you the actual calculations, what they look like, And then we have some benchmarking as well as a path forward for if you were to adopt system development fees. So system development fees, what they are, they're fees that are charged to new connections that are joining your water and sewer systems, or they're customers that are acquiring additional capacity. So if you had a building that was torn down and you had a larger building built or some change in use and you needed incremental more capacity, you could also charge a system development fee. And the idea behind these is that they're intended to have the cost of constructing water and sewer capacity be paid for by growth. So the concept of growth pays for growth. The fees do need to be applied based on units of service. And so if you're a single family home compared to an industrial building, you need to have a differentiation in terms of how you charge those system development fees. And as we talked about a moment ago, the fees are legislated in North Carolina. They went in place in July of 2017, and the legislation and the statute very prescriptively describes how you have to calculate the fees, how the fees can be used, how they can be applied, and so gives you really strong guidance in terms of what the fees can be and how they can be used. And so we've used that guidance to calculate the fees. And just have a few comments and considerations in terms of system development fees. First off, system development fees do allow the community to recover at least a portion of the cost of constructing capacity. So if you think about it, you've built this water and sewer system, and when somebody comes and connects to it, you've made significant investments to allow them to connect and to have that service. So the lack of system development fees, they do place the full cost of infrastructure on your user rates. So right now you don't have system development fees. So really your primary and pretty much only revenue source is user rates to fund the capital and the operating and the expansion of the system. But there are some potential impacts on development in terms of, if you put these in place, would it have an impact on economic development? But I will say that they're very, very common within the state of North Carolina. Developers are used to dealing with system development fees throughout the state. There are requirements and limitations in terms of the use of system development fees. So you have to separate them and put them into a separate fund. The legislation provides specific guidance. You can only use them for capital. You cannot use them for any type of operating expense. So there are limitations on their use. In terms of the approaches that can be used, there's 3 that are outlined in the legislation that are shown here. There's the buy-in method, the incremental cost method, and then the combined approach. And so essentially, the buy-in method says that we're going to calculate the fees based upon what we've built to date. So it looks at the assets that are on your books and sets the fees based upon those assets. Typically, that approach is used when you do have ample capacity to sell, so you're not bumping up against your capacity limits. And that approach would be most common for that type of situation. The flip side is the incremental cost approach, which is you're essentially out of capacity. You're constructing a whole bunch of additional capacity, and you're going to set the fees based upon that incremental next unit of capacity. And so you'd use the CIP or your capital improvement plan to set the system development fees. And then finally, the combined approach takes a combination of the two, buy-in plus incremental, and sets the fees based upon those two. And that would be done when you do have ample capacity to sell, but you're also expanding the system. Based on discussions with staff and looking at the capacities in your system, the capacity expansion projects in your CIP, we are recommending that you use the buy-in approach in terms of calculating system development fees, and that's what we've calculated, and that's what I'll show you as we go forward. So a little bit more detail in terms of how the calculation works. So the system development fee is essentially calculated by taking the value of the system minus credits, divided into the system capacity. So the value of the system as put forth in legislation is the depreciated value of your current assets in place, brought up to current replacement dollars. So we take your fixed assets from your financials and bring them up to current dollars. We have to take out some credits from that. We have to take out outstanding principal on debt service, because otherwise we'd be charging folks twice when they join the system. They'd be paying for it in their rates as well as in the system development fees. And then we also have to make sure we take out any assets that you didn't pay for. So if you have donated assets, things of that sort have to be taken out. And then we divide by the capacity in the system, which is generally measured in units of service. often termed equivalent residential units or ERUs, which would be equivalent to a single-family home. So that essentially gives us our system development fee. So what this looks like for the water system, again, using the buy-in approach, up at the top, you can see the two categories we have of assets. So you've got about $48 million worth of source of supply and treatment brought up to current dollars. And then you've got 42 million in transmission distribution. So this would say your total value of the system brought up to current dollars would be $91 million for water. Those credits that I just talked about, so we have to take out the outstanding principal on water debt. We have to take out those donated assets. So this gives us a net system value of $78 million. So that then is our numerator, which then we can divide into our system capacity. So your current water system has a max day capacity of 14 million gallons per day. We define a single family unit as needing 360 gallons per day on a max day. And so this would say that our number of units in the system would be about 39,000 units. So you just do the math, and essentially what we've come up with is a system development fee per ERU for water of about $2,000.
That is on a 3/4 inch water tap, your standard residential one. It's going to vary, which you'll get into, I'm sure.
Yep. Yep, so that's per ERU, so that would be similar to a single-family home. Next slide, I've just got the same calculations on the sewer side. So more value, about $140 million in terms of replacement cost of the sewer system. Again, take out the credits, you have a little bit more debt, 16 million. So we have a net system value on the sewer side of 121 million, almost 122 million. The capacity on the sewer side is 14.2 million. Again, we use the same capacity per ERU, which ultimately says we've got about 39,000 ERUs in the system. Calculation comes up to about $3,000 per ERU on the sewer side. So next slide just gets into the way that we would charge this based on units of service. If you remember, we need to differentiate depending upon the size of the customer needing capacity in the system. And so the common approach is to scale it based on meter size, similar to what you do with your minimum charges on your water rates. But what we can do is we can use the AWWA, so the American Water Works Association has meter equivalent that are based on the hydraulic capacity of the meter, so how much water you can get through the meter. And these are very common to use in terms of scaling. So what I just calculated and showed on those previous slides were 2,000 and 3,000. That would be for one ERU or a 3/4 inch meter, your typical single family. And then as you need a larger meter, because you're a larger customer, you would scale up those system development fees based upon the meter equivalents. And so what that looks like, given the calculation, again, for your typical single family, that'd be $5,000, water and sewer combined. And then as we scale those based upon the size of the meter, you can see that they do grow pretty substantially. So this would say if you have a 6-inch meter, new customer joining the system, they should pay about $221,000 for buying into the system. So in terms of what this looks like, again, these are all communities that have system development fees currently in place. This is just for water. Vast majority of municipalities within the state of North Carolina do have system development fees. This is just a sampling. All of these communities do scale the system development fee by meter size. This is just showing a benchmarking of the 3/4 inch or the 1 ERU. And so you can see at that $2,000 calculation, you'd be kind of in the mid to lower end of the range of these comparisons. When we look across the state, again, you'd be about the same in terms of that lower to mid range. $2,000 for water is very common across the state. On the sewer side, you're a little bit higher in terms of the comparisons at that 3,000, but again, not outside of the norm in terms of what we typically see across the state. And again, these are all scaled by meter size as well. So just to wrap up, Because of the legislation, there are specific requirements if you were to move forward with adopting system development fees. So there's actually a process you have to go through. You essentially have to have a report in these calculations posted on your website and made publicly available for 45 days. Then the comments that are received need to be considered and factored into the analysis. You would need to hold a public hearing on system development fees, allow the public to provide their input, and then you essentially need to publish them as part of your fee schedule or your budget. And then you do need to, if you do adopt them, you do need to update them every 5 years. So anytime you change them, you'd essentially need another study done, or at least look at them at a minimum every 5 years. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
I would ask a question. Do you have any experience with how other cities treat development fees in relationship to their fees they charge for the service, for the water sewer to the customer? In other words, the rates.
Well, typically, it does, I guess a community that has system development fees is potentially going to have the opportunity to, because they have that other revenue stream, they're going to have the opportunity to have slightly lower rates. I mean, it does provide a revenue stream to your utility to provide for capital.
I understand
Makes
that's
sense.
not a constant like a rate fee is, but still.
Correct, and I'm not sure I 100% understand the
Can you go
question.
back to the slides of our peers?
Yep.
So, Mayor, this is showing you, Goldsboro's not in that chart right now. We're not charging these fees, right? So to catch up with our peers, this happens a lot on the western side of 95, on the eastern side of 95. We're trying to catch up. In the end, if you adopt this method, people who are coming in, whether they're residents or businesses, are going to pay this fee, which helps reduce the cost to the current resident or business to keep all this system up and operating. So that's the decision. We'd like the council to tell us to go ahead. There's a bunch of procedures we have to follow before we could adopt this, but we would like council's direction on whether you want to move to system development fees.
That's sort of the question I was asking, and you gave the answer.
I just wanted to provide a little context here because before 2017, before the legislature changed, hundreds of towns were charging impact fees. And even the smaller towns were charging impact fees. And that's what it basically called system development fees, which replaced impact fees. Because impact fees in 2017 were statutorily eliminated. The School of Government at that time was saying, we don't know that there's authority for people to charge these water and sewer impact fees. So the legislator went back and they created very specific ordinance or details on how to create this. So this is not a new tool. And even though you see it's commonplace, it's been in place, and I would say that a lot of them are going more back to the system development fees to replace some of the lost revenue that they, when the statute changed, and most of them have. But I just wanted to put that in context. This is not anything that's new. It's just the statute has said, here's the way to do it, and I think the statute's good because it does accurately reflect the cost of providing services. You have to calculate that in there, whereas before it was just all over the map on the charges, and it was done everywhere throughout the state, illegally or not. It was just done. Now it's more defined now, which is good.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of customer would have that 6-inch meter that you were talking about, like for the system development fees? I don't know if I'm asking that right there,
Mhm.
like,
Yep.
what does that customer look like? What type of business or would that be?
I may defer to engineering to some degree. I mean, it's going to be a big water user. That's a really
That was-
significant meter size.
Like a school or?
Bobby, address that.
Great question. The probably most recent and best example is Mount Olive Pickle, which is going over about 795 over at the old SBX flow area. So an industry or user of that capacity would be a 6-inch, typically for residential.
More questions?
I just would like council's thought on this, and if we can move forward with this in the budget process, or you want more information, or what, because, David's here to answer those questions. We can bring him back later on if necessary, but this is a significant change for us.
So to follow up on that, I would ask the council just to indicate sort of consensus if we want to consider a system development fee. And if so, then we need to plan for that and put it on the schedule to speak in April at the very latest.
So I'm not quite sure where I stand on it right now, but just for clarity and trying to make a decision, what we're saying is a system development fee would kind of lighten the burden for the residents in terms of, can you just kind of give me a little bit, another excerpt of that?
Yeah, essentially, if you think about it right now, when somebody joins the system, they don't have to pay anything. They're not for the infrastructure that's been built and maintained. And so essentially, if you have this revenue stream, it does provide you with another, there's a bird in here.
That's not a phone, it's probably birds in the chimney, isn't it?
You now have a new revenue stream that allows you to pay for, if you use the buy-in approach, you can use it for repair and replacement, capital, anything capital related, you can use it for debt service. And so it does lighten the load on not just residents, but any existing customer of the system. You now have a new revenue stream coming in. And I guess to the point of moving it forward, there are communities that you could publish the report, get the feedback from the community. That's not saying you're actually moving it forward. You have that ability at a public hearing to say yay or no, nay in terms of whether to move forward with it or not. So you could essentially offer it to the public and say, this is what it looks like, this is what we're calculating, see if you get some feedback, comments, and then make that decision.
Correct me if I'm wrong, sir, but before, we shouldn't act too hastily and assuming that they will have an impact on the upcoming rate increases, because we don't know what those figures are at this point in terms of the revenue from the development fees.
Yeah, that is true. We wouldn't want to say, most of the communities that we deal with do have system development fees, and therefore we do account for some revenue stream based on anticipated, in the pipeline growth and things like that. So we could factor it in to some degree, but over time it's going to, be more and more of a factor. And
sure.
For instance, people already who've moved forward with coming into our system, Mount Olive Pickle, right? They would not pay this fee because they're already moving forward. The ARPA funding that was given to us, $22 million to help make that, goes a long way towards the system development fee. But we have a lot of housing developments that are proposed to come. We talked about 1,500 units. That could go a long way when you have to buy in at $5,000 a unit to help future costs of repair. So it's either, do you want to put some burden on people buying in or none at all?
So where does that development fee for potential development take place? We've already got.
I'll let Matt talk to that. Go ahead.
Permits issued?
The statute requires it goes into a special capital reserve fund. I guess the best way that I can answer a question, it's not the best analogy, but if you think of a city road, city maintained road, everybody drives on it, everybody that pays taxes has to pay for it. But the people that are coming in, maybe they're using your system and they're tearing it up. So you have a toll in place so they can use it. Now that's kind of what the rate is, but when we have a toll, when we build something, it's a way to kind of recapitalize the fund so that we can replace it in the future, or pay for it now if we've already built it so that they can come in and use it, and it gives us flexibility down the road to be able to replace it without having to put the entire burden on the current ratepayer, or in this case, if we use the road, the current city taxpayer, but this is a ratepayer in a sewer system, or water and sewer system. Does that help explain it a little bit better?
And so if we were to move forward, if council, we had a consensus right now to do that, you'd have to post this report for 45 days.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can come back to a public hearing and see what the public has to say. And then you can make a decision as to whether you want to do this or not. So you're just kind of giving us a concurrence to move forward and see what the art of the possible is, or to not do anything.
Yes. We can't annex, but we absolutely say a large apartment something like that. That means our existing taxpayers are the people in that area. I don't know how we can not do that. Eventually,
Head nod or a motion? Does a motion need to be made or just a consent?
There's no official decision here. This is, you post the report, hear what the public has to say on it, and we come back for a public hearing. They will put that notification out there, and then you'll have to vote after that at some point in time or not.
So, is there a consensus of going ahead and posting the report for public comment for 45 days, and then coming back and let the council take that information into consideration and decide to move forward or not?
I'm in support of doing something for sure, but I think we ought to talk to, not necessarily that we're going to take their advice, but I think we're going to want to talk to economic development region as well as WCDA, just because they are some of the folks that recruit some of the 3, 6, 8 inch folks into the community. I'm in favor of doing something. Make no mistake about it. I think that we're going to want to have that conversation with them probably before we post it publicly. Get a little bit of feedback on, are we benchmarking ourselves against appropriate communities, given who our competitors are for those economic development projects. But in general, yes, I also am in favor.
Is that, did I hear you say that before we post the public comment for 45 days, we need to have input back from our development alliance folks?
Fair point. Let me ask a clarity question. Are the numbers in here the numbers that we will be stuck with once it goes public? Or can the public input be part of what's used to determine the numbers?
Well, and
You can change it until you've actually made it firm, and then it's 5 years, good for 5 years, right?
yeah, I mean, that, you can't go higher than what we've calculated. The
Okay.
council would have the ability, and I generally don't recommend it because I think it becomes somewhat arbitrary, but this is the maximum amount you could charge. You could charge anything less than it. You could say, we like these, but we're gonna do it at 50%. There are communities that have done that.
Then I'm comfortable posting public and then having that conversation. I just think it's important that we involve them, given the volume of projects coming through.
And that's when we would go to the CDA.
Okay, that's what we'll do then.
All right, sir, thank you. Thank you, David.
All right, thank you, appreciate it.
Okay, just before lunch here, we're back on timeline. We have water and wastewater asset inventory assessment with Bobby Kroom and Withers and Ravenel consultant Ken Ori.
Good morning, Mayor and City Council. So with the discussion we just had, it's a great segue to move over to our water and wastewater AIAs, our asset inventory and assessments. So if you recall previously, the City of Goldsboro received 2 separate $150,000 grants to do a water AIA and a wastewater AIA. At that time, we hired one of our on-call contractors, which is Withers Ravenel, to do both of those studies. And to give an update on that is Ken Ori with Withers Ravenel. He has 25 years of experience with communities, a broad spectrum of communities. He is currently the practice area lead for Withers Ravenel and guides a group of 50 engineers and support staff that deal with water and wastewater projects in our area. So with that, Ken, and just so you know, you're the only thing standing between City Council and lunch. So.
I also realize that one bird in the chimney is worth 2 in the bush. Well, so the other thing I have to say is, we have to work on our definitions of retreat, because this is definitely not my idea of retreat. But thank you very much for having me. There's a couple of things I just want to go into. So this money that was given to you by the state, we were the first ones to have this work done in accordance with given to a number of surrounding communities. This is kind of a very dry topic, but you have a big job ahead of you. And that discussion you had just before this was perfect, because frankly, with the growth you have coming in the 70s, most of your infrastructure was paid for by the EPA and some of that stuff, and on the backs of your current residents. So now you're going to be looking, I already joked with Bert that said every dime you have coming in through that system, they already have it spent. I mean, you have some big decisions, 10, 15 years, that have to be made, otherwise some of the infrastructure is gonna make it for you. So with that being said, what I'm gonna do is briefly talk about what is an AIA, what did we do, what's the assessment, critical and risk analysis, and some of the findings, and then the next steps. We gave this presentation, I forget how many months ago, I think it was almost like 8, 9 months ago when we originally finished. So again, this is the law that was passed, you were given this money as part of the Viable Utilities Reserve, the study came in, gave everybody a bunch of money. And it's intended to allow you to look at the reserve funds as well as the conditioned assets of your water and sewer. So what was it intended to do? It was intended to say, what's the current state? Going back to the Stantec presentation, which was a great presentation, by the way, going back to that presentation, that's the dollar amounts. And so, with that study, we have some stuff in here that because we were working kind of in parallel tracks, we could probably add some money, probably a lot of money to that based on some of this stuff. What's the required sustainable level of service? Should you be designing for hurricanes? Should you be designing for everyday situation? What's critical? Obviously, the connections to Seymour are very critical. You have a lot of you have a level 1 trauma center here. That is critical. You need to maintain that. And of course, what's the capital improvement and what's the operational and maintenance facility? And of course, for the last one, what's the best long-term funding? So what did we do? We went through all your televising of your system, and we updated your wet weather model. So what we did is we said, when it rains, how much water do you get at the plant? How much is going into those leaching basins? You've probably heard some stuff about the equalization basins from in the past about Seymour Johnson wanting those closed, wanting those to be taken care of. And so we had to look at, how much water is actually being put in there, what's going to happen with those. We looked at those designs. We looked at what happens when you get an inch of rain versus 5 inches of rain. What's the impact? What is, what's keeping Bert and Bobby up at night with some of these issues? And how do we address that? And then, of course, the groundwater and river level. One of the most probably infamous pictures I use in a lot of my slides is actually there's a picture of your staff taking a boat out to one of the pump stations. That pump station is now the one being abandoned as part of the project for Project Butter. So because we've done this level of planning and because we were able to work with that and quickly turn around cost estimates and benefits and say, if you want this industry coming in, this is what it's going to cost. So because of the proactive work that was done on behalf of the staff and the council here, we were able to turn around that answer in about a week. And in 3 weeks, suddenly we had this money in front of us. So it's that level of planning, which is what we're doing, which allows us to respond to the market, to the different funding streams. So what did we find out? What we found out is depending upon the river level. So it's not necessarily whether or not it's raining here, more so how the river level is. We have had anecdotal information about this forever, but we actually have quantifiable qualitative data now. Exactly what's going to happen at your plant, whether it's raining or not, or what the groundwater or what the river level is. Basically what we're saying is that there's 10 miles of pipe that have capacity issues when the groundwater's low or when your river's low. When that river is high, or the groundwater is high, kind of like it feels like it hasn't stopped raining in 2 months, you have about 30 miles of pipes that don't have capacity. So again, going back to that discussion that you just had about those fees, what we're saying is that if you want that industry, you want that $200,000 connection fee, it's because you're going to have to update, make pipes bigger to make sure that they have more to give. When the groundwater's low, you're okay. I would almost consider that somewhat negligible. Everything's pretty manageable, especially with the EQ basin you have at the plant. If the groundwater's high, you're going to overflow about 120,000 gallons of raw sewage straight into the river. Surcharge manholes, which just means manholes that are getting full, and then essentially pump stations that become too small. So again, when you're looking at growth and you're thinking, you're seeing 16 of your pump stations no upstream homes unless you improve the pump station. There's no upstream industry unless you improve the pump station. So those are the things, and that's what we looked at, especially because this was part of that viable utility reserve, so that it was about looking what communities, what areas outside can Goldsboro accept, and what is the impact? So again, so what we looked at here was, this is 10 plus, this is a 10 plus year, 20 year. You can see some of these numbers. You probably can't see this, but I believe you have in your packet. Your pipes alone is 62 million worth of repairs. The total for your sewer, just in what you have now, based upon the Stantec study, was 140. That wasn't saying what had to be fixed. So that number of 140 that they had didn't really include this $60 million number. You should almost double that.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Could you speak more into the microphone, please?
Yeah, I'm sorry. So I just keep 10 in front of my screen because that's where I can see.
Just move it, there you go.
Right. Yeah, I'll cheat. How many engineers does it take to fix a microphone? So again, so if you think of that $140 million number that justified about $2,000 or $3,000 worth of fees, add 62 million to it, and that doesn't include some of the work that we're talking about at the sewage plant as well. Now, what did we do in the water? Again, same thing. We went in, we looked at we assessed it. We looked at the age, the material, the diameter. So Parker Colbath was the one who walked in. He handled most of the modeling that was in here, which is why I wanted him to come and kind of experience some of this. Again, we did hydraulic modeling. Butter came in and they said, how much, we need this amount of water. Yes, no, how can we provide it? So right now, if anybody wants to come into Goldsboro, we can tell you exactly how much water they're going to be able to have and what the impact is going to be on the plant. We also did, as a side note, we did do some work at the plant as well on the structural because there were some issues there. Happy to talk about that later, but essentially we kind of checked that box and said, from a structural standpoint, the plant is you don't need to be concerned with it, but in 10 to 15 years operationally, that plant will have to make a decision for you. But so these are the different things we looked at: fire flows, pressure, and storage. And the important part is that we delivered a tool that allows Goldsboro to look at this development very quickly. Because a lot of this stuff, we did some studies for Rocky Mount, 10 MGD facility that they need for water every day, 5 MGD worth of sewage. They came in and said, hey, we have a mega site, we need you to look at this. And within a week, we were able to turn that analysis around. That's the kind of environment we're in right now. And so again, you made the investment, you developed these tools up front, which can help this. So again, we looked at the fire flow, which means no longer does your fire department have to go out and turn valves for another 5 years. We looked at all the different areas of pressure concern. So we can kind of predict when that phone's going to ring from an operational standpoint because someone can't get pressure in their second floor shower. And also we looked at water age, which is an idea. It's water quality. The longer the water stays in the pipes, the less amount of chlorine and the more likely you are. Some of the other things we looked at was, again, the raw water. You actually have 2 sources of water you can produce from, which in recent events, you can see how important that is to have that ability from an emergency and from a resilience standpoint. So all of that information was done so we can react and the town can react as they need to.
I have a question.
Sure.
How big of a factor does the age of the pipe contribute to, including the diameter and possibly
the cholesterol of the pipe?
Right.
So it's interesting. There, for some reason, it's called the Hazen-Williams C factor. I always call it the cholesterol factor, right? So honestly, the age is not nearly as important as how the water typically flows through it. The larger pipes you have some very large diameter pipes that are always flowing, water never really stops. So it doesn't really give the material a chance to kind of, and rust and the tuberculation, it doesn't really give that a chance to set in. But a lot of the small diameter stuff, I mean, that's exactly what we have a map and we were able to show. So to answer your question, we actually have exactly what that cholesterol level is or is expected to be in the pipes, and that kind of goes into some of to skip ahead, that goes into creating this chart. Because the more cholesterol that's in those pipes, the more likely we're seeing that they need to be replaced.
So the friction losses, like I said, looking at it from a standpoint like that, is greater in a smaller orifice than it would be.
That gets less water, yes, right? Because I mean, water is meant to be healthy, right? It has minerals in it. It has all that kind of good stuff in it. But that does have a natural reaction sometimes when it's in the pipes that leads to that cholesterol. So again, so what you see here, Stantec's report had 91 million for water in their report. What we're seeing is again is about another 30 million on top of that, just to maintain the system and get things back. This has some water quality stuff. There's a lot of looping, and we worked very closely with your staff on these projects. These are not just things that we decided. It was things that we workshopped out. So I'm happy to go back to the 29 or 60 million number, which is typically what everyone cares about. But if there's any other questions, I know that I'm not going to stand between you and lunch. Yes, sir.
If you go back to the spreadsheet that you're on, just one slide back, you probably said this and I was a space cadet, but year 3, what's the 8.8? Never mind. I see the label up there now, all the way out to Fort Township.
Mm-hmm. So again, this does not necessarily address the future water plant. I know, I've had very preliminary discussions with Bert and the staff about you are concerned long term because it takes about 5 to 6 years just to build a plant. If you said go right now, you're not turning a spigot for 5 to 6 years.
Is Fort Township currently served?
Can you talk about that just a little bit more on Fork Township? I mean, it's a growing community. You're talking about enabling growth out there with that
Yeah, so currently
CIP item.
Oh, the CIP item. Yeah, so right now there's a much larger demand out there than what the current water line. It can serve it, but basically the entire area experiences pressure issues and volume issues just because the line's too small. And again, if there's going to be continued growth out there, and that's a perfect example of the system fee, that if they're going to continue to expand services and growth beyond that area, they're going to need a water line. So the question is, and the purpose behind the fee is, should the people that live down here have to contribute because somebody wants to build a new house up there?
All right, and that's an estimate. I mean, you don't have to do that. You don't have to extend it. You don't have to grow the city, et cetera. But
Correct.
That's their job, is to create a CIP on the art of the possible or what we think should be done. There's
To address
something
pressure.
there's something you're not covering here, a $4.7 million bill that we're going to have to do for the water line testing. That's an estimate we have right now. We'll see what that comes in. Robbie's probably talked to you about that, but that's going to push this CIP further to the right by a year probably. Bobby will probably talk to that maybe a little bit tomorrow when he gets a chance to come up and do his items. Bert will probably talk about that.
Is
Bert's
that the
had
lead in service?
Yes. Yeah.
So the good news, I'm not going to steal his thunder. The good news is there is a new funding stream coming out that is the presentation. They presented it yesterday at the SWIA meeting.
Okay, what is that? Because we don't like unfunded mandates, but.
Okay, yeah, well, there's no, so, I'm going to get yelled at by Bobby. So what that is that the official documentation is not out. So the exact guidance document will be out in the next week or two, perfect, just in time for all the retreats. But what it's saying, and what we're doing something, kind of a trial for Smithfield, that we're going to submit an application this spring, and what we're saying is that we have enough general information within the computer that we've given to them that says, in general, here's your pipes that may have lead and copper. They may be. So what they're saying, the state will pay for the study, the field work, and the actual construction to replace at 100%.
That's That's nice.
Yes, that is, again, right?
This is out of the
but it's a
budget
state, so
excess,
there's
I
always
guess?
a big but at the end, right?
Yeah.
But right now, you don't know what that actual number is, so the 4.7 is probably, it's probably a best guess based on some of their analysis. And so we're kind of putting in something that says, okay, we assume that 50% of those service lines actually are going to be. You know, so those are the assumptions that you can move forward in this spring round for an application.
Okay. Thank you.
That's,
As of right now, it is 100% grant. Again, that could change. They haven't published the final. They have a couple tidbits. But that'll be in the March 8th class is when that guidance will be finalized.
any other questions?
Out at Paramount, because we didn't have the pressure, because we didn't know what we did. And this is just valuable information for us going down.
I wouldn't thank me. The credit's due to your staff, and I'm not just saying that because I'm the
They've
paid
done a good
consultants,
job.
but your staff really gets most of the credit because they've been the one directing us.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it, Ken.
No problem. Thank you.
Mayor, if I can just mention here, Bert was anxious to jump in before Ken Ori. He's got a CIP, but I think it might be better to present that tomorrow. We've got two presentations that are moved to this afternoon, the council budget discussion and the nonprofit budget discussion to whatever degree we want to do that. But you've essentially got an hour opened up tomorrow from 11 to 12, and we can finish up Octavius's strategic planning piece, and then we can get Bert's CIP item discussion in there. So that's currently in your binders in case you're worried about that. Good?
And just one reminder for the break, if you can fill your evaluations out and make sure you put the presentation on the line there, so we'll know what presentation you're rating. Thank you.
Just work on evaluations.
Yes, sir. I mean, you want to take a break here for the lunch?
Yep.
Recess, and then come back at the 12:30? Or we could try to fit Bert in there, but you might be better doing that tomorrow.
We'll recess until 12:30.
Okay? Thank you, sir.
Got lunch ready there,